Here's every single Castle Crashers challenge run I've ever done in order of easiest to hardest. I hope you enjoy. 'Twas the night before Christmas, and the barracks were loud. There were music and cheers, it was quite a crowd, but it all came to a stop when the knights heard a knock. The evil wizard was here, he stole the king's gem. The wizard flew away and the king called his men. But the knights didn't move, they were stun as a log. Bellies too full of that festive eggnog. The king was desperate, he needed his gem back. How else could he fill up his big present sack? The elf heard the king's call and went on his way to retrieve the king's gem and save Christmas Day. So to celebrate Christmas, I wanted to see if we could beat Castle Crashers using only snowballs. And of course, this challenge wouldn't be complete without Pelter. So getting straight into the run, we went through Barbarian War and came across the War Machine. Now with it being this early into the game, we don't have a lot of magic. That means our snowballs aren't doing a lot of damage and we can't throw too many. But with the War Machine being the first boss of Castle Crashers, it wasn't too difficult to bring down. One problem we'll run into during this challenge run is deciding where to put our skill points, as we want to level up our magic to increase our damage and throw more snowballs. But at the same time, the further we get into the game, the more damage the enemies will do, and not having any defense will make it a lot harder. But right now, this wasn't an issue as we went into the Barbarian boss fight. Now having projectile magic is great for this boss, as from a distance, the Barbarian boss can't really do much. So all I had to do was keep my distance and keep throwing snowballs, and just like that, the second boss was down. Now snowballs are not great for cutting things, meaning we couldn't cut down the red princess. So this is now the second challenge run, we will have to leave her behind. We soon moved into Thieves Forest where we came across the Troll Mother. Since we could only damage one enemy at a time and had limited snowballs, areas that were very dense with enemies were challenging, and the Troll Mother went to prove that. Since there were so many trolls, we couldn't really kill them, as the Troll Mother would just spawn more. This resulted in us having to run around the area to try and avoid the many trolls, and if we were lucky, get a snowball that hit the Troll Mother. We were also able to jump over the trolls and throw a snowball, which would most likely hit the Troll Mother since she's a lot taller. But overall, we just had to keep moving since we could easily get stun knocked in a large group. And after a challenging third boss, we were chased through the old mill and landed in the river below, and thank God the river wasn't frozen. Now the river was awkward, since the bats killed us if we rode the debris, meaning the best way to defeat the bats was by jumping out the water and throwing our snowballs. But at the same time, we couldn't defeat the fish while in the water, meaning we had to ride the debris. This made it very difficult having to balance being on debris and being in the water. But soon enough, we made it onto the fourth boss, that being the catfish. Now unlike the bomb only run, we could actually destroy the catfish's furball, meaning we could do this boss like normal. The only issue was we could throw 5 snowballs per magic bar, meaning there was just a lot of waiting around. But apart from needing patience, the boss itself was extremely easy since we could block almost every attack. But after a long time, the catfish went down and we finished the level with a whopping 78 XP. And that's another issue for this challenge run. XP works in Castle Crashers based on the number of hits you do to enemies, meaning the more hits you do, the more XP you get. Since our build is high damage, we aren't getting many hits on the enemies, meaning we are barely getting any XP, which just further adds to the problem of having to decide between magic and defense for our skill points. But ignoring that dilemma for now, the next boss was the bear. Since the bear's a normal sized enemy, every snowball we threw knocked him over. But since we could never have a fair fight, there were also 3 other bears we had to avoid. And also, Rami. I swear, whenever I use Rami, he's never this good. But we really had to wrap this fight up. Since it was raining, there was a good chance our snowballs could melt, but luckily we could find shelter in PP Straddle's cave. And in the cave, it seemed PP brought his family over for Christmas. And these bats were a real issue, but PP was quick to discipline his kids and get them off of me. It seems PP ate too many pigs in blankets. The knights eventually caught up, but it seems the eggnog hadn't worn off since they didn't really do anything. And after delivering the knights, the king had to return back in order to wrap the presents for Christmas. King? King? Oh my god. Excuse me? Where's he going? It's the other way. Okay then. Oh. We moved on to the Groom boss fight, and someone needs to tell the Groom that we're throwing snowballs, not bombs. You'll be going on Santa's naughty list this year. We rode a knockoff Santa's sled, and they don't really look like reindeers. But for the parade section of the game, I stood at the back of the carriage, so as I was throwing snowballs, any thieves that would spawn would automatically be hit. This also kept me safe as it prevented the thieves from spawning behind me, which was a problem in the last challenge run. But the new problem in this challenge run is the lack of defense, as I did die on this section and had to redo it a second time. But on our second attempt, the giant troll was defeated and we can move on to the Cyclops boss fight. And once again, someone needs to tell these bosses that we're throwing snowballs. But for the Cyclops boss fight, it once again wasn't too bad as the damage windows are quite generous. So all we had to do was dodge in and out of attacks, throwing our snowballs when possible. And after a lot of snowballs, I think the Cyclops got a little cooled as he dipped in the lava to warm up. He'll be okay, right? But for the second princess, we once again couldn't save her, meaning we had to back out and leave her behind. But I'm sure she can fit through that cage. I mean, genuinely, there's nothing holding her back here. Next was Lava World, and we didn't want to spend a long time here, as our snowballs could melt. But on our first attempt, we did get instantly killed by the skeletons, meaning we had to rerun the area a second time. And on our second attempt, we made it to the volcano boss fight, where we actually learned something pretty interesting. So to damage the volcano, you need to be beefy. Regular attacks and magic do no damage. But whilst in beefy mode, pelter snowballs actually can damage the volcano. So given enough time and enough sandwiches, Pelter could solo the volcano boss, which might have just given me a future video idea. And for the second boss of Lava World, the dragon is a little awkward when it comes to projectiles. Despite the dragon's size, the hitbox for projectiles is pretty small, meaning we had to stand in a very specific position in order to do damage. And after testing out different methods, we did find a position which made us safe from the falling boulder and damage the dragon. The only annoyance was the fire demon. But upon killing the fire demon, there is a small window to which you can damage the dragon before the next fire demon spawns. So we repeated this pattern until the dragon was defeated. Next was the industrial machine, and this was quite interesting. So normally, the 5 pillars in the middle are the easy part of the boss, with the fingers and turret being harder since they're above fire grids. But since we were limited to only throwable magic, it meant defeating the fingers was extremely easy since it couldn't really get close to us. But the pillars in the middle were difficult. Since we only had limited snowballs per magic bar, it meant we didn't have enough burst damage to destroy them. So we had to go through multiple cycles until we could destroy all 5 pillars. And for the turret, we simply just had to dodge in and out of attacks, throwing a snowball when possible. Eventually, the industrial machine was destroyed, and my chat once again decided the fate of the industrial prince. And it must have been a Christmas miracle, as the first time ever, my chat voted in majority for the industrial prince to live. So this truly was a Christmas miracle. In fact, I was so moved that I went across the ocean and visited the desert to show them some Christmas love, as I imagine they don't get much snow. But after showing them what snow to the face feels like, I think the aliens wanted to try some too. So I also showed the aliens how to do a snowball fight, although I don't think they fully understood it. But I was invited onto their ship to have a full-blown snowball fight, except their snowballs hurt a little bit more. I think the snowball fight got a bit out of hand. But after showing the locals in the desert the fun of snowball fights, they decided to show me what they do for fun. So we had a game of beach volleyball, which I ended up winning 10-0, but Pelter didn't seem to understand that we'd won. Next was the marsh, and the only real issue in this area was the second troll mother. Once again, it was simply down to there just being a lot of enemies. But at this point in the game, we had a lot more magic, meaning we can throw more snowballs and do more damage. But that didn't really matter for the corn boss fight since it has 4000 HP. So for the corn boss fight, I actually got these 2 civilians here to help me on the fight. I stood far back, throwing my snowballs, which kept me safe and out of range of the corn's attacks. And the civilians, they just took the damage. And after a very long time, the corn boss was defeated. Next was Medusa's lair, and there's a lot of water in this level. Walking through water will reduce your movement speed, so my best option for attack was to jump in the air and throw my snowballs downwards. But soon enough, we made it to the Medusa boss fight, which wasn't too bad. If you stand next to Medusa, her only real attack is this one snake in her hair. It will try and melee you, but it can be blocked with a shield, and the damage windows for this are very generous. So we simply just stood next to Medusa, throwing our snowballs until she was turned to stone. We moved on to Full Moon, which has 3 beefy stove faces, but they actually weren't an issue for this, since projectile magic is a great way of dealing with beefies. So after defeating all 3 beefies, we moved on to Ladder Strat, but for the first time ever, Ladder Strat couldn't help us here. Since we could only damage one enemy at a time, there was no point in grouping all the enemies together, meaning it was a lot more effective to just run around in circles and target one enemy. But it's okay, because I could finally have a real snowball fight. In Snow World, the Eskimos know how to do it, although I was a little outnumbered. They even had Pelter's long lost cousin, but we eventually moved on to the Frost King, which is very similar to the corn boss. The fight itself isn't difficult, it just takes a painfully long time. The Frost King teleports all over the arena, meaning you have very short damage windows. Combine that with a slippery floor and you've got yourself a long boss fight. But having range was a real saving grace, since all we had to worry about was being in line with the Frost King, which slightly increased our damage windows. On top of that, when the Frost King teleported, it actually gave us a good chance to recharge our magic. So in the end, the Frost King wasn't a bad boss. Maybe I'm still salty from the no-hit run. And for the third princess, we once again could not save her. But unlike the red princess, the green and blue could easily escape. I mean, that gap is big enough for both of them. But after not saving the third princess, we could move on to the final stage of the game. Now I was worried. Cult minions have a 100% damage resistance to elements. And if I learn anything from my bomb only run, then this could be the worst part of the challenge. I'm talking about spending hours on the cult minions alone. But to my surprise, snowballs aren't considered an element in Castle Crashers, meaning we were doing normal damage to the cult minions. So bombs are an element, but snowballs aren't? But I wasn't about to question the logic, because this just saved me hours of headaches. Our first of the 4 bosses was the Painter. For the Painter boss fight, you have to destroy his paintings in order to get a small damage window on the Painter himself. But luckily, we had leveled up defense quite a bit at this point, so we were able to tank the damage of the paintings, which is great because these paintings have quite a bit of health. I repeated this until I got the Painter to about 40% of his health bar. This will start the second phase. The Painter will come down and run around the arena while spawning multiple paintings. But I simply just ran around the arena, avoiding the paintings and throwing snowballs at the Painter when I could, until the Painter finally died. Ew, is that fruit on Christmas? Next was the Undead Cyclops, and just like the original fight, it was pretty easy. His casket swings can be blocked, meaning all I had to do was throw snowballs and block his attacks. And of course, PP ground strat. So after many PP ground strats, the Cyclops was defeated and we can move on to the third boss. I made sure to restock my healing potions before going into this fight, and with 5 healing potions, I was ready. There are 2 waves of enemies we have to defeat before we can fight the Necromancer. For the first wave, I simply just ran around the arena, throwing snowballs when I could. The first phase is pretty easy. The problem is the second phase, since there are now 3 beefies and even more enemies. However, I actually found that jumping in the air and throwing my snowballs were extremely effective. This allowed me to stay off the ground, preventing any damage from the enemies below. And with me being in the air, some of the enemies were struggling to hit me, meaning they'd try to throw a bomb and hit the other enemies instead. And of course, during all this, the brutes did pick me up and throw me a few times. But since I restocked my healing potions, I was able to heal from any damage. I eventually thinned down the enemies to only a few, meaning I could throw snowballs from the floor and be a bit more precise with who I wanted to damage. And on my first try, I defeated both waves of enemies. All I had to do was defeat the Necromancer himself. Let's see how that goes. So since the Necromancer is a regular sized enemy, he will fall over from projectile magic, and if I was able to time it correctly, I could just throw another snowball the second he got up, meaning the Necromancer spent the entire fight on the floor. So after a very successful Necromancer fight, I could finally move on to the final boss of the run. For the first phase, I could only damage one crystal at a time, so all I did was wait for the crystals to land and target one of them, repeat for 4 crystals, and I could move on to the second phase. For the second phase, the evil wizard will come down and have 2 different coloured bubbles, blue meaning we could damage him with magic, red being melee. Of course, for this run, the blue bubble is the one that mattered, so I simply just waited for him to have a blue coloured bubble and threw my snowballs. For his third phase, he's floating in the air as a ball, meaning I use my magic jump to gain height and then spam my air projectiles. This allowed me to stay in the air and do damage with my snowballs, so I repeated this for the 4th and 5th phase, which led me on to the final phase. For the 6th phase, the Necromancer will summon a sword, and with this sword can do multiple attacks. With one of these attacks, the evil wizard will jump in the air and summon meteors. For a very short amount of time, he is completely stationary in the air, meaning I could magic jump up and throw a snowball at him. Apart from that, the evil wizard is pretty agile, meaning it's quite hard to hit a snowball on the ground, but if I am lucky, I can get an odd hit or two. I defeated this until I finally defeated the evil wizard. I landed on the king's crystal, caught the final princess, and rode it all the way back to the castle. So 1 out of 4 princesses saved, but hey, at least Christmas was saved. Can you beat Castle Crashers by only using the worst magic in the game? Let's find out. So for this challenge run, we'll be using the king character as he has the worst magic. Please don't start an argument in the comments. And this is because his main magic ability does not do any damage. But since at the beginning of the game, the only magic you have is the main magic, we first had to level up a little bit to unlock his second ability. And that is it, he throws a golden banana looking knife. So we begin the run by leaving the king's castle and wait.
You think you're the king? I'm the king!
I don't know who that guy was, but anyway, my kingdom's been invaded by barbarians, so I take it upon myself as king to protect my people. After clearing out the first area of the game, I went and picked up the Beholder pet as it will give us a +4 to our magic stat. I also picked up Hattie's weapon for the +3 magic boost as well. So with Hattie's weapon and the Beholder, we were now hitting for a massive 28 damage per knife. So this run was a little bit unusual as what we're used to, as we had a lot of damage, but we had a very slow fire rate as well as having to rely on recharging our magic bar. So not surprisingly, the first boss of the game went down very quickly as we were chunking his health bar. And for the second boss, well, he wasn't too much of a challenge. Soon we come across our first giant enemy, which if you've seen the level 1 run, you know I now have a new hatred for. But luckily, since we were using magic, I didn't have to go close to these giants, so they weren't too difficult to take down. We soon found ourselves in the forest, and we eventually came across our third boss of the run. Now this boss, like the other 2 bosses, didn't have a lot of health and we did a lot of damage to them, but we did have a lot of other enemies to worry about, so we had to run around the arena a little bit and jump to throw a knife to get the boss, or else his little minions would take them for him. And after being chased for a little bit, we end up in the river. Now for some reason, in this run, we encountered a lot of glitches, and here is a good example of a major one. But glitches aside, we were struggling in this section because our magic wasn't able to hit consistently. We could only throw a knife straight and the enemies were below us. So we needed to unlock a magic that allowed us to throw downwards. So we went back to the forest to gain some more levels. And soon enough we unlocked the second magic attack we had for this run. It was once again just another knife throwing attack, but it allowed us to throw knives downwards whenever we jumped in the air. We quickly moved on to the catfish fight, which was very easy. And this is because I learned you could block his attack. So all I had to do was block his attacks, and then when it came to damage, throw as many knives as I could. On top of that, our new magic threw knives even faster than the original magic, so we had more DPS. And for the next boss, the enemies seemed to got a little confused because they thought they were doing a magic only run, so I was just getting spammed with constant magic attack. But the boss himself wasn't too difficult, mainly because we could use this attack which allowed us to shoot from the air, which made it a lot safer to throw our magic. And pretty quickly the boss fell. Soon we entered the caves, which has these slime enemies which are notorious for being my least favourite enemies in all of Castle Crashers. But I gotta say, they weren't too bad hard this run. Since I did a lot of damage and had range, I was able to defeat them pretty quickly, so they didn't really have time to run away. But eventually we came across our next boss, which was the bat boss fight, but once again we somehow managed to break the game. So for some reason the bat boss just stood there smiling. I'm not too sure what caused it, but after getting a little bit too cocky, this happened. Oh wait, no, wait. Oh, these bats. No, wait. I take it back. No, please. Let me. No. I take it back. I deserved it, so I had to run through the entire cave again, but this time we defeated the bat boss. Next was the flower area, and our doppelganger king was here, so we stole his horse since we are the rightful king, and I think he very quickly learned his place as him and the knights did all of the work for us. So after the knights and the fake king took care of the enemies, the fake king seemed to take a liking to me. Yes, king! But soon enough we went onto the castle walls, and once again I let the knights do most of the work, until a giant enemy spawned in and really wanted me dead. Yeah, I don't think the giant knights really like me. We eventually made our way inside the wedding, where we came across some of the most annoying enemies in the game. So here our jumping magic wasn't really effective because they kept throwing bombs at me, causing me to take damage. But at the same time, I don't think it's even them throwing the bombs, because where did this bomb come from? During this fight, however, I wanted to try and talk it through instead of fighting, so the enemies decided they would listen, but war never changes. For the boss fight at this stage, he wasn't too difficult because you can stunlock him pretty easily. If you got your timing right, you could pretty much just have him on the floor the entire fight. And for the bomb section, all you really had to do was run around and not get caught. So yeah, pretty easy boss. And for the carriage section of the run, we actually learned that the boss has a very strange hitbox. You have to hit his eye dead on with the magic, as the jumping magic wasn't doing anything since it was almost like missing his hitbox. So once we figured that out, it wasn't too difficult. And after slowly making our way through the areas of the game, we made it to the Cyclops boss fight. Now this guy is really not too bad and probably one of my favorite bosses in the game, because you have to get your timing right, and if you do, he isn't that difficult. So all I had to do was dodge his attacks and then get my damage in between, and by doing this I was able to get his health down pretty fast and even skip his entire enraged mode. So we were finally able to rescue the second princess. And wait, we're the king and they're the princesses, and we And moving into the lava world, we unlock these sandwiches, which allows your character to become big and buff, but this isn't a good thing. Yeah, I probably wasn't going to eat the sandwiches too much. Up ahead, we had a very close call with these skeletons. There were a lot of them, and I can only damage them one at a time, so it was getting a little bit sketchy. On top of that, whenever I'd run out of my mana bar, I would have to wait for it to recharge, but luckily I was able to get through it. And eventually we came across our next boss of the run, but unfortunately this boss is a pain, and that is because you can only defeat him whilst in sandwich mode. This means he's immune to regular attacks, magic attacks, and pretty much anything that isn't sandwich mode. So for this run, can you beat Castle Crashers using only magic? Then the answer is no. But if you've seen the other videos on this channel, then you know this isn't going to stop us. So after swiftly defeating the boss in sandwich mode, we moved on. We eventually come across the dragon boss fight, and similar to the bow and arrow run, we had to get in a specific spot in order to damage the boss. However, the hitboxes for magic seem to be a lot more forgiving than the bow and arrow hitboxes, as we were able to consistently hit him. This meant we were able to defeat the dragon boss fight pretty quickly. And after the dragon boss fight, we were able to collect the golden wheel. This meant we only needed one more thing to progress the next part of the game, and that is the golden telescope. It can be found in the industrial castle, so that's where we headed off to next. The industrial castle is very difficult since it has some of the best magic using enemies in the game, as well as it having just a lot of enemies. On top of that, we only just hit level 10. So the way the XP system works in Castle Crashers is it's based on the amount of hits you do to enemies. So since we are doing a lot of damage, which means we don't need to hit them very often, we are barely getting any XP. But next we moved on to the elevator section, which as you can imagine wasn't too fun. There are there are a lot of enemies in a very cramped space and we can only damage them one at a time. Plus these enemies love to throw bombs. So I slowly defeated them one by one and luckily just made it past the elevator. But to compensate for that, the boss fight was very easy on this build, since for this boss fight you really want to have range instead of melee damage, and we just so happened to have a lot of damage in a ranged build, so the boss quickly fell. I once again asked my chat if the industrial castle prince should live or die. You guys are maniacs. And just like that, we had the golden telescope. We then went and got the leaf weapon to upgrade our stats, as it gave a +3 to magic and a -1 to strength and one quick bolt trip later, and we were in the desert area. We were now hitting for a massive 45 damage per knife, so these enemies didn't stand a chance. I normally hate these enemies, but since I didn't have to go close to them to melee them, I was able to defeat them very quickly. And that goes for this entire area, as normally a melee build would be very slow in this area, but throwing knives was very fast. And for the UFO bosses, it was very fast since our knives were now hitting like trucks. And for the alien section, it was a little bit slow since we could only damage one enemy at a time, but it wasn't too difficult. And for the escape scene, we of course did it first try. So it turns out the aliens are a pretty decent XP farm, so of course that's why I went back to do it again. But we had actually unlocked the final magic we can use for this build, and that is the King's Jump attack. This magic allows us to jump quite high, but will also damage any enemies that are near us. And on top of that, it's the King's only magic that can damage more than one enemy at once. So this was actually huge, as we were able to damage multiple enemies in a single magic use. And for the second escape scene, I was able to make it to the escape pod pretty easily since, well, I was actually trying this one. And soon we made it inside the sandcastle. Here we come across a lot of giants, but once again, with a ranged build, it wasn't difficult. And combining our jump magic with our knife magic, we're able to get a lot of DPS from a very safe distance. So we flew through this stage all the way to the volleyball game, and we did it first try. This gave us the map, which allowed us to progress to the next area of the game. Now there's an increase in difficulty for the next part, and that can be seen here when we go against 4 giants and more enemies. On top of that, it's quite a small arena, but eventually I was able to run around in circles and kill them off one by one. And once I got past that part, I actually used the King's magic to heal myself. And soon we came across the corn boss, which is one of the most annoying and random bosses in the game. But luckily, once again, since we were using a range build that did a lot of damage, we were able to get very consistent damage on the corn boss. So it took a long time, as it always takes a long time on this boss, but it wasn't too difficult, and soon enough the corn boss fell and we got our horn. Using the horn, we were able to unlock the next area of the game, which had these murloc enemies, but I did the Castle Crashers equivalent of teabagging them to death, and I would use this for pretty much the entire area until we eventually came across the Medusa boss fight, which not surprisingly was very easy. All we had to do was keep a distance from her and she pretty much could do nothing. So after a little bit of throwing golden knives at her, she eventually died. But moving on, we went on to the part of the game which is easily the hardest non-boss area, and that is because the enemies in this area have a lot of armor, so they have a good damage resistance as well as doing good damage themselves. I thought I was doing alright since I was doing 44 damage, but I got humbled pretty quickly. Yes, that giant just one-shot me. But on the second attempt, I took it a little bit more slowly and carefully, keeping my distance from the giants, and was able to push through all 3 of them. And after defeating the giants, we go against a lot of the small enemies, and if you saw my last Castle Crashers run, you would have seen that we created a strat called the ladder strat. So we kind of used that to make a ladder strat 2.0. By climbing down the ladders, it forces all of the enemies to follow you, and that perfectly groups them together to get one big attack on every single enemy. And by using my magic jump, I could damage all of them as well as just jump to the top of the ladder. So I used ladder strat 2.0 to defeat all of the enemies and move on to the next area. For the snow part, it was actually a lot more difficult than I thought it was going to be. In this section, some of these enemies will stay behind ice barriers and throw snowballs. This made it very difficult as I could only damage one enemy at a time, as well as having to constantly dodge these snowballs. And more often than not, I would get caught quite a bit. So this area actually took a lot longer than I thought it was going to do, as well as being very difficult. It just goes to show how different parts of the game can be either very difficult or very easy depending on how you play. But after a while, we made it to the Ice King boss fight. Now I actually forgot to grab Yeti for this fight, which is a pet that makes it so you can't be frozen, but it didn't really matter since most of my damage was done from a range. It meant that I wasn't really going to get frozen. On top of that, using the jump magic mixed with the knife magic, it meant I could actually get very fast, consistent DPS whilst being out of range of freezing. So surprisingly, this boss fight was very easy. On top of that, we were doing 65 damage per knife, so eventually the Ice King fell, and we finally saved the third princess. Just don't think about it. And with the Ice King defeated, we could finally move on to the final section of the game. Now these enemies before the final 4 bosses I thought were going to be a massive problem, as they are 100% resistance to elemental magic. This means that if you try to use magic on them as an elemental character, you will do 1 damage as well as not stunning them. Now I was really worried for this part, as I thought this could have been a run killer, but luckily banana shaped looking knives don't count as elemental magic, so the enemies just took the damage as normal. And before defeating any of the 4 bosses, I actually went and changed my pet as well as my weapon. So with the new gear acquired, I went and took on the first of the 4 final bosses. For the first boss, I thought it was going to be pretty difficult since we had a low defense, but I was very wrong. We were hitting for 50 damage per knife, so DPS wasn't going to be a problem. On top of that, since we could do range damage, this meant that I could defeat the paintings from a safe distance, allowing us to not take the damage. So this fight went pretty quick. I was able to get constant, very fast DPS on the boss and defeat his paintings. So 1 of 4 bosses down. However, something pretty unexpected happened. So after defeating the boss, you have to destroy this crystal in order to unlock the next boss. But for whatever reason, this crystal was a boss in of itself. And there's 2 more. But after Crystal the Invincible fell, we could move on to the second boss. For the second boss, it turns out there's a cheese that someone in my chat let me know about. And if you let him slam you with the coffin, you would go underground. But as long as you stayed underground, they just couldn't do anything. So I used this to pretty much cheese the boss. In fact, it got so bad that the boss decided he wanted to leave. But after some persuading, the boss came back so I could finally defeat him. And that's 2 of 4 bosses down. Now moving on to the third boss, and I was pretty afraid. So I recorded this run pretty much a few days after my level 1 run, so I was still pretty beaten up about the Necromancer fight. If you don't know what I mean, then I highly recommend you watch this video here, but I was very afraid to do this fight. I mustered up the courage to finally go and face this boss again. I died. Was this gonna be another 2 hours of my life? Surprisingly, no. No, it wasn't. Since I had access to the jump magic, this allowed me to get away from the enemies, so it protected me from things such as getting caught in a juggle by the enemies. On top of that, I was able to combo it with my knife throwing magic, allowing me to stay in the air for quite a decent amount of time and damage the enemies below. So surprisingly, I defeated all the waves of enemies. But surely the Necromancer was going to be difficult, right? Nope. If you ever wanted to see the Necromancer get teabagged to death, then here you go. Pretty surprising considering how the last challenge run went. But after defeating the Necromancer, we had to defeat Crystal the Invincible one last time. And after that, we could finally move on to the last boss of this run. For the final boss, the first phase wasn't too difficult, it was just a little slow as we could only really damage 1 crystal at a time. But after a little bit, we got onto the second phase of the boss fight. Since our magic hit like a truck, all we had to do was wait for the blue bubble, which allows magic damage only, and get in our hits. We were hitting for 63 damage, so it went by pretty fast. And once again, the third phase wasn't too difficult. Using our jump magic and knife attack combo, we were able to get very good DPS on his little bubble phase. So 3 phases down, 3 to go. Surely his spider phase will be difficult. Nope. Once again, by using our jump magic to get height, we just threw knives at him. We were doing a lot of damage and throwing it out quickly. For the 5th phase, well, it went exactly how you thought it was gonna go. And for his final phase, surprisingly, was very easy. Since when he jumped up to shoot his meteors, we could actually reach him with our jump magic once again, and well, just spam knives. But after a very short amount of time, the boss finally died. We landed on the crystal and caught the final princess. We rode the crystal all the way back to my castle, and well, oh thank God for clowns. Can you beat castle crashes using only the bow and arrow? Is it possible to defeat every single boss without swinging your sword once? Keep watching to find out how it went. I picked the thief character because, I mean, looking at his picture, he's ready for a bow and arrow challenge. Now that I had the character picked, let's see how much damage... Oh dear. So, 6 damage per shot only can hit one enemy at a time and a very slow fire rate, this was going to be a lot harder than what I thought. But after clearing out the barbarians from the first shop, I bought a healing potion as I was going to need a lot of these for this run. Straight away I went and picked up my Albert as he gave a +4 to my agility stat. Agility is the stat that increases your arrow damage and the speed of which the arrow fires. Next I picked up a weapon, and even though I'm not using a weapon throughout this run, weapons can actually have stats. So here this has a +1 to agility and +1 to defense, and with them very small but significant upgrades it was time to go and storm the barbarian castle. We were now doing a massive 8 damage, but with the amount of enemies that the game liked to throw at me, it was taking a long time to clear each stage. But soon we got to the very first boss fight, the battering ram. For the first boss it was easy enough, just shoot when you had the chance to shoot, dodge when you had to dodge, and with that 8 damage it took a while but eventually the battering ram died. Up ahead was the second boss of the game, the barbarian boss. Once again the boss itself wasn't too bad, it just took a while having to dodge and shoot, but the real problem here was the enemies that would spawn in whenever you was trying to fight, as they would get in front of the arrows and take the damage, or would knock me down when I was trying to line up a shot. And after we defeated the boss we get to save our first princess. However, there was a massive problem. The game wants you to cut down the princess to save them, but this means having to use a sword. No matter how much I tried, I could not use the arrow to chop them down, so unfortunately I did have to swing my sword. But this was not used to deal any damage to any enemy, so technically the run is still valid. Shortly after I went against my first giant enemy, and here I surprisingly learnt that the bow and arrow is actually very effective against these guys. Every shot would stun them, and after every 3 shots they would fall to the floor, making the big guys not a threat for this run. Up further ahead I was struggling to keep track of my character as it was just all thieves. But unfortunately in the forest this is where I encountered my very first death of the run. There were simply just too many enemies and I wasn't able to take them out fast enough. So I went and tried the area again but once again died, causing me to have to go back to a previous mission where you fight these barbarians to unlock the shop just to buy healing potions. With a full inventory of potions I was able to push on through to the third boss, which was actually one of the hardest bosses of the entire run. This boss will spawn a lot of smaller enemies to fight you instead of actually fighting you itself, and with a build that can only damage one enemy at a time, did very little damage and shot very slowly, you can see why I struggled so much here. Luckily there was a fire pit nearby and I was able to use this fire pit to burn the enemies, but the boss did not get burned in this fire pit, so I essentially had to train the enemies around this fire to kill them off, and then when I had a free opportunity I was able to get 1 or 2 shots off on the boss. This went on for a while but eventually I was able to get the final blow on the boss. One quick chase scene later and we were going on to the next area. The river area was very annoying because we had these bats that kept attacking me, and normally you would just hit them to get them off, but we couldn't hit with our sword, and hitting them with a bow and arrow was extremely difficult, so they just kept attacking me and I couldn't really do much about it. However, I actually found out that the bats will not attack you if you are not riding anything in the water, allowing me to jump up and pick them off one by one. And then we went straight into the catfish boss. Now I've done catfish so many times that I've essentially memorized his moveset and how to dodge everything, so this boss was extremely easy even with the bow and arrow. The only real problem was the lack of damage, so it just took a long time, but the actual difficulty was very easy. The next boss however was not so easy, as we had to deal with multiple enemies again that would constantly respawn even if you killed them, as well as the boss not being able to get stunned or knocked down by my arrows. So I had to resort to running in circles and trying my best to get the odd 1 or 2 shots on the boss until the boss finally died. Moving into the caves, the slimes were annoying as ever. These are the most annoying enemies in all of Castle Crashers and I will die by that fact. Why were these added to the game? Next was the bat boss fight, which I thought was going to be very difficult, but it actually wasn't too bad, because all of these bats I thought were going to be a problem, but they actually just stayed behind the big bat, so as long as you just kept running in circles, they wasn't really a nuisance. And with the boss himself, all you had to do was wait for him to land and get a few shots on him, and rinse and repeat. One quick stop to the shop to get some more healing potions. Oh hey Bob.
Hey Wrecker, have you ever wondered why our faces kinda look like...
See you later Bob. Next we went to kill some bees because... Why are we killing bees again?
Because we said so.
But don't we need them to, like, survive? Moving on. Next boss was not too bad. I normally struggle on this boss because this is where the difficulty really ramps up, but he actually stunned with every arrow that I shot, so as long as you keep him stun locked, it really isn't a difficult fight. And that can be said for the next boss fight too, as once again, as long as you just keep shooting arrows at the boss, he couldn't really do anything. But soon we find ourselves in another cave. Wait, cave? Does that mean... At this point I was running low on health potions, but I realised that you could actually destroy these mushrooms. If you use the shovel tool here, you can actually destroy them without swinging your sword, so hey, free healing. And after facing my most difficult enemy yet, Wally Invincible, I was quickly on to my next boss fight. Like with Catfish earlier, I'd done this boss so many times that I'd pretty much memorised his pattern, so he really wasn't difficult. It was once again just a case of getting in your shots when you could and dodging his attacks in between. And with that boss defeated, that was the second princess saved. Moving on. Next was the volcano part of the game, and this is where things kinda get a little iffy. So a new mechanic is introduced with these sandwiches which will make you big and strong, and this is introduced through a boss fight which can only be defeated using these sandwiches. That is right, we've got a boss that can only be damaged via this sandwich mode. So for anyone watching who wanted the answer of can you beat Castle Crashers with only the bow and arrow, then the answer is no. You cannot beat Castle Crashers with just the bow and arrow. You can now click off the video, and thank you for watching. But for all you amazing people that decided to stay, we swiftly moved on to the next boss, which I would say is the second hardest boss in this entire run. Not only did I die here, causing me to have to rerun through the entire area again just to get back here, but this boss was not a fan of arrows. I don't think the creators of the game expected anyone to defeat this boss with only a bow and arrow, as it wasn't really connecting. The arrows would just fly past the boss or would do this weird kind of like drop. But I figured out if you stand in this specific spot right here, you can sometimes get an arrow to hit. It wasn't always consistent, but with enough persistence, I was able to chip away at the boss's health, defeating him with only the bow and arrow. Another quick stop at the shop to get some more healing
Hey Rekka, why does your face kinda look like mine?
Next, however, was the Industrial Castle, regarded as one of the most difficult areas in Castle Crashers. However, at this point I'd been leveling up agility quite a lot to the point where my bow and arrow was firing very fast and doing very good damage. So as long as I kept my distance from the enemies, it was actually a pretty good build. And same can be said for the boss, as this was actually the easiest time I'd had with this boss fight on any character so far. Since for this boss fight you had to rely a lot on doing range damage, and since my entire build is built around range, I did not struggle at all. And one quick boat trip across the ocean, and I was in the desert area. Now this part of the game is actually my least favourite in all the Castle Crashers because of these creatures. But once again, having a very strong range build made it very easy. The only part that was very annoying was the alien ship boss battle. See, the only drawback to this build now is that when you jump you can only shoot one arrow. On top of that, there was a lot of recovery time as well once you landed. This meant for this build to be optimal, you had to stay on the ground. However, when you were fighting two UFO boss battles that are in the sky, it went a little slower than I would like. The alien ship was actually a lot easier than what I thought, since at this point you get swarmed by a lot of enemies. But since my bow and arrow had basically turned into an automatic rifle, I quickly mowed down all of the aliens. Now all that was left to do was to do a very simple and quick escape scene that you should really be able to do first try. As I was saying, you should be able to get past this part first try. Oh, for the love of God. I made it successfully inside of my escape pod. First try. And quickly made my way through the desert area. No, I mean quickly. My character was very fast at this point. Who even needs a camel ride when you run faster than the camel? Now at this point, I could really see just how strong this archery build was, as I was able to juggle enemies with just the bow and arrow. Yet, juggle them. Is this an optimal build? Is this a thing? And after a quick game of volleyball using some totally legit strategies to defeat the enemy team in a very fair and precise way, I was given the map. With the map we were able to progress to the next area, but before doing so, went to go get a better weapon now that we're level 15. And is that +5 to agility? Yeah, at this point, can you even call this a challenge run? I don't know what to say. This boss is normally a very long, drawn out boss fight that's quite annoying, but was very easy with this build. Like, this build is actually good. With the corn boss taken care of, we now unlocked the horn, allowing us to progress into the next area. And once again, the boss took about 1 minute. This is insane. But for the next part of the game, it really ramps up in difficulty. The enemies have a lot more health and defense. So surely we were going to struggle. Nope, the enemies couldn't even get close to me. I was like a monkey holding darts, and all I could see were balloons. I was so fast at this point that not even the ice could catch me. And after embarrassing the Ice King and defeating him in a record time, third princess was now saved. Moving on to the last area of the game. And going against these new enemies, they didn't stagger or fall over to the arrows. They just kind of took the damage. And after being hit with a million arrows in a nanosecond, would eventually just fall over. Oh hey, here's a boss fight that relies purely on keeping a good range from the enemy. I wonder how this one could go. Next up was round 2 with the groom and his golem, because after crashing his wedding, we also had to crash his funeral. Maybe that's why the game's called Castle Crashers. But this boss fight went exactly how you expected, get the damage in when you could, and then run around in circles. At this point we essentially had a machine gun and was extremely fast. This build was insane. In the third boss fight, after violating all of the enemies, I actually had a semi-decent challenge. I couldn't just melt this boss as he was very aggressive and he constantly made sure to stay close to you, so a range build wasn't optimal. But with how fast I was able to fire off the arrows, it was very easy to block his damage and then shoot a couple of arrows off. So yeah, the only boss that actually took longer than a minute. And this brings us on to the final boss of the run. For phase 1 of the boss fight, it was simple enough, just avoid the crystals and then damage them when they landed. For the second phase, when the boss had a blue shield, you could only damage him with magic, and then red shield phase we were able to get a few shots off with a bow and arrow, and was a simple enough rinse and repeat. For the boss's third phase, he went and floated in the air, my one and only weakness, so this was actually an interesting challenge, as I was no longer able to rapid fire and had to jump and get one shot at a time. So this phase really slowed down the pacing of things, as I could only shoot once. But given some patience, the boss finally fell, and finally we was able to open the So after all of the easy bosses, the game had to humble me and put me up against a really difficult part of this boss fight, as I was now having to jump to only get one arrow off at a time, whilst also having to avoid the 2 enemies on the floor. And if that wasn't bad enough, the hitboxes on this boss were awful. And I mean awful. For some reason, the arrows just had a mind of their own and would decide if they wanted to hit or not. There was no certain spot I could stand in to guarantee an arrow hit, which made this the hardest boss in the entire run. And after a lot of missed arrows, I unfortunately died. However, since I was level 20 now, I was able to upgrade my weapon once more, and again I found a weapon with a +5 agility and +3 resistance. And I also decided to retire Meowbert. He's carried us through this entire run from start to finish, but unfortunately couldn't help me as jumping would only let me shoot one arrow at a time, so the extra agility didn't really help. Thank you Meowbert, your service will be remembered. To take over this hero, we recruited Ramming Ram, as he would help take care of the 2 enemies on the floor by knocking them over, giving me a bit more opportunity to get damage on the boss. For my second attempt, I'm not sure what happened, but the hitboxes were even worse this time. But for what felt like an eternity, I was able to get that last arrow to bring him down. And finally we can Oh, there's more. For some reason, I was really struggling to hit him during the floating ball phase compared to the original one. And I'm not sure, it felt like he was even further up this time. I'll put the 2 fights side by side and see what it's like whilst editing this video, but he definitely was harder to hit. This took a long time. But once again, after an eternity, we was able to bring him that there's one more phase. Now for this phase, he was on the ground, but he would also do an attack which would see him go in the air to shoot meteors down. So luckily it wasn't too bad this final phase, as I was able to get a few shots on him whenever he would land. And after a lot of patience, we finally defeated the final boss for good. I stored his sword, crystal and his girl and rode it all the way back to the castle. Back in the castle, me and my fellow comrades celebrated my success. Even Meowbert was enjoying retirement. Meowbert, you got us through it. And after showing a different thief what a true archer build looks like, I was finally able to end this run. The alien in Castle Crashers has a really unique magic, so I want to see if you can beat Castle Crashers by only using the alien magic.
No other reason.
But first, here are the rules of the run. We can only damage enemies using alien magic. We are not allowed to level defense, and we can use pets for this run. And back to the video. So the alien is the only character in Castle Crashers that cannot change his weapon. That means for the entire run, we are stuck with a level 1 weapon that has no stat buffs or critical bonuses. But at least it has fire. So, what is the alien magic? Right, so getting straight into this run, we begin with having to defeat the
Barbarian.
But it's too late. The kingdom's princesses are already being kidnapped. But do not worry, princesses, I will save you, eventually. After defeating the
Barbarian,
I went to the pet nursery to pick up the cutest little guy. So the beholder will give us a +4 to magic, which increases our damage to a whopping 17. So after blasting our way through the barbarians, we face our first boss of the run. So just like the bow and arrow run, the most annoying thing about these boss fights are the smaller enemies that get in front of your shots. But with enough running around in circles, we were able to quickly defeat the first boss. And for the second boss of the run, it's obviously the barbarian boss, and once again he's not too difficult. Moving into the thieves forest, and I don't think the thieves realise that we have technology. So the thieves stood no chance, and we quickly moved on to the third boss of the run, that being the troll mother. And this is all starting to sound a little bit too familiar, almost a bit like deja vu. And who do you think would win? The troll mother and her babies living in the forest, or... Oh, how the tables have turned. Oh no, turn them back, turn them back. Phew, thank God for the river down below. Oh hey, is that a dancing fish? So the only annoying thing in the river are the bats, because for some reason they just have the wonkiest hitboxes when it comes to projectiles. Where do you think the bat's hitbox is? Is it A, the bat itself, B, slightly above the bat, C, right next to the bat, or D, way off to the left of the screen? If you chose D, then you are correct. So for some reason, we have to shoot to the left of the screen and that hits the bats. So after lighting up Casper, we could finally move on to the catfish boss fight. So at this point in the run, we can only shoot our alien blaster 3 times per magic bar, and catfish only has small damage windows. This meant the fight was a lot of waiting around for the damage window, then only being able to get a few shots off. So for most of the fight, I had my shield held up just blocking damage, and wait, alien, is that a grenade? So in the tall grassy fields we can find these bears living in the nature, and of course we got to give them a taste of that miracle. So after coming and freeing the land, we eventually move up to a cave and find 2 of the princesses being taken by these mysterious figures. So we made it here a little bit too late and just missed them. So I took my frustrations out on Pipistrello. Wait, no, Pipistrello, no, I'm sorry, please. Next was the flower fields where we killed these innocent bees, but thank God there's no lawyer bees, am I right? And in the wedding crash, everything was going really well, so surely nothing could go wrong. And for the groom boss fight, it was extremely easy since we could literally keep him on the floor and keep shooting. Except he decided he wanted to escape death. Like look at his health bar, there's nothing there. And for the carriage section of the game, the boss itself was extremely easy. But the problem was, the thieves kept standing in front of me to block the shot, or standing behind me and shooting me, which made this boss far more tedious than it needed to be. And I wasn't paying attention to my health bar, and I actually did die on the carriage boss fight.
FBI, open up!
We eventually got into the Cyclops boss fight, and it actually wasn't too bad, just as long as no one trips into this open grave of lava. Oh, for God's sake, Cyclops. Next is Lava World, and wait.
Nice.
So the alien splash magic is considered explosive damage, meaning that the fire demons have a large resistance to them. But luckily the alien's projectile magic isn't explosive, so we're all good. But what's not good is dying straight away. So even though we can actually do damage this time, the fire demons still pack a punch. That and having literally 0 defense does not help at all. So we went back to the pet nursery and picked up in Snowball, regarded as one of the best pets in Castle Crashers. Just look at that 5 damage. Now Snowball carried us to about halfway through Lava World until we died again. So we gave Lava World another go, and at this point we'd unlocked our aerial projectile magic. And even though it's the exact same as our normal projectile magic, it actually allows us to shoot whilst being on the move. On this run we made it all the way to the first boss of Lava World, that being the volcano. Now the volcano is a gimmick boss as you can only damage it by using the sandwiches. But like the Bomoni run, we are able to shoot a splash magic at the volcano and then eat a sandwich straight away. This gives us a pitiful amount of damage. It is possible on paper, but in practice it would take a very long time. But at least we got to see buff alien. For the dragon boss fight, we actually found a really OP spot. This spot allowed us to hit the dragon with our projectile magic, but it also made it to where the falling rock couldn't hit us. So all I had to do was stand here and spam my projectile magic. So after an easy victory, we grabbed our first relic. So Industrial Castle is definitely one of the harder parts of the game, but their resistance to explosive and fire damage is nowhere near as bad as the fire demons, making the Industrial Castle extremely easy for the alien. But the Industrial Castle does house one of the hardest enemies in all of the challenge runs we do, the Brute. So let's see how he is in this challenge run. Yeah, so the alien's magic is extremely good against beefies. And for the industrial machine, a range build really excels here. Since you're stuck in this middle area, it's kinda hard to melee the fingers. But with an alien blaster, it was extremely easy. And it was at that point in the run where I let my chat decide the fate of the industrial prince. Yeah, most of you guys are evil. But with the industrial prince defeated, we are able to get the final relic and go across the ocean. I sure do hope we don't get attacked by any pirate ninjas. Next was the desert area, and if you know, you know. I really hate this place, brothers, take me away. Inside the alien ship, we broke free from prison and got to the main control deck. I then proceeded to alien hominid all over the place until all the enemies were dead. And it was at this point in the run where we made an amazing discovery. The aliens have butt cheeks. We eventually made it to the beach volleyball where we found out that the volleyball was invincible, so we did have to melee to hit the ball, although I'm not the one cheating, just look at this. Moving on to the marsh level, and at this point we could fire our blaster quite a few times, which made it extremely easy against these beefy skeletons. And as long as the enemies don't have a damage resistance to fire or explosive, we were just melting them. We had a round 2 with a troll mother and she's dead. Next was the corn boss fight, and as usual, it wasn't fun. We got the peasants to join in on the fight just to speed it up a little bit, but we did actually find out that the alien splash magic can damage through the corn boss's invulnerability. It didn't help much, but hey, pretty cool. For Medusa's temple, we were hitting the fish people for 83 damage, so it didn't take long until we got to the Medusa boss fight. No, don't you dare comment that. No, scroll back up to the video, but hit the like and subscribe button whilst you're down there. We defeated Medusa, yay, moving on. At this point we had unlocked the alien's jump magic and it's a little bit bright, but we were able to successfully pull off a ladder strap for this run. So we can we can move on to the next part of the game. For the ice section of the game, the enemies were extremely easy, but what wasn't easy was the ice barriers. These things took an entire magic bar +1 just to destroy. So the hardest part of this level was just destroying the ice. For the Frost King, we were hitting for 71 damage, which was pretty good. Plus, since we had range, it actually wasn't that bad of a fight. So after a little bit, the Frost King fell. So if you watch my Bomoni run, then you will know that this place is a nightmare. The cult minions have a 100% damage resistance to all elements. That means the alien splash magic does only 1 damage to the cult minions. But truly, thank you Behemoth, that the alien's projectile magic does not do explosive damage, meaning we were not going to spend hours on this section again. So the first of the 4 bosses is the painter boss fight, and this actually wasn't too bad. We did a lot of range damage, meaning we could destroy the paintings without having to take damage, meaning we could save our potions for the other 3 bosses and defeat the painter boss without really any problems. So after defeating the painter boss fight, we went to the crystal room, destroyed the crystal, and moved on to the next boss. Is what I wish I could say. That's because my chat trolled me to go back into the painter boss fight. With the promise of a hidden Easter egg, I went back into the painter boss fight, and at that point, my fate was sealed. The painter boss respawned, and I had to redo the fight all over again, and it even costed me an extra potion. So after defeating the painter for a second time, I moved on to the second boss with one less potion. For the undead Cyclops, we once again just abused PP ground strat. Yeah, we were hitting for 71 damage, so it didn't take long. 2 down, 2 to go. So the third boss is the Necromancer, which always seems to be the make or break of these challenge runs. We either complete it without that much difficulty, or we spend hours of suffering on this boss. And after dying on our first attempt, it wasn't looking good. So the problem with the Necromancer, apart from it being a lot of enemies, is that all of the enemies are very different to each other. So we obviously have the brutes who are bigger and can throw you. We have a fire demon who has resistance to our splash magic. And we have someone like the Conehead who throws bombs and can't be normal juggled. So there are a lot of enemies, but they're all just so awkward to each other. Luckily our splash magic is extremely effective against the beefies. On top of that, our splash magic also has a decent blast radius, meaning when we hit the smaller enemies, it would more than likely hit others too. This resulted in a lot of magic spam, and after a little bit we defeated all of the enemies. Let's see how the Necromancer himself fares. So the Necromancer couldn't even stand up, meaning 3 bosses down, 1 to go. For the first phase of the final boss, we wanted all of the crystals to bunch together so we could do this. And after defeating the final crystal, we moved on to the second phase. For the second phase, we did this. For the third phase, he was in the air, so we couldn't spam our splash magic, but you know what we could spam? Our air projectile. For the fourth phase, he's in the air again, just more spidery, so you know what we did? Spammed our aerial projectile. For the fifth phase, we spammed our aerial projectile. Oh god, where am I? Oh yeah, for the sixth phase we spammed both our splash magic and aerial projectile magic. And with that, the evil wizard was defeated. The temple began to crumble, so we landed on the crystal, caught the princess and rode it all the way back to the castle. Woo! Yeah! Awesome! Oh no! So yeah, I just completely fell off the trampoline.
So you can't do any jumping then?
Not really, but I'm sure everything will be okay. Whilst I fight off the barbarians, let's go over the rules for the run. First and foremost, no jumping. Now my character's feet are allowed to leave the ground, but as long as I don't press the jump button, it's okay. And the final rule is no juggling, because you can actually start a juggle without having to jump, but that would just kind of ruin the entire run. So with the first wave of barbarians defeated, let's go get a weapon and pet. So our first pet is going to be Giraffe, as he will give us an XP bonus. We are going to need to be level 8 for Thieves Forest, so this is essential for leveling up. For our weapon, we're going to choose the Lollipop as it gives us a +5 to agility. We want as little damage as possible to maximise our XP gains, and the +5 agility is nice for the extra movement speed. So soon enough, we make it to the War Machine, which is our first boss of the run. This boss serves as a great tutorial to the combat in Castle Crashers. So with very little damage, it's still not difficult, and I was prioritising getting as many hits as I could so I could maximise my XP gains. And soon enough, the first boss was down. Moving to the second boss of the run, we once again were doing very little damage, but we're getting quite a bit of XP. All we had to do here was avoid the barbarian boss's attacks, as well as the smaller barbarians that spawned in. And without much difficulty, the barbarian boss fell and we could save the princess. Except the princess is high up, and we can't jump. I tried everything I could think of in order to save the princess, but at this point in the game, we just couldn't do it. So we had to leave the princess behind and move on. I'm sure she'll be okay. So at this point, we were only level 5 and we needed to get to level 8 before the Thieves Forest. So I went back into Barbarian War and played through it again. I played through it until I hit level 8 before backing out. I once again returned to the pet nursery where I picked up the best pet for this challenge. We also grabbed the blacksmith's hammer, which will give us a +3 to strength. So with our upgrades, we could finally move into the Thieves Forest. So we needed to be level 8 so we could unlock a certain melee combo. Doing this combo will allow your character to slightly lift off the ground. And this is exactly what we needed to get past the required jump in the Thieves Forest. So by activating this combo, we can get just enough height to grab onto the ledge and pull ourselves up. I sure do hope there are no other sections of the game that require you to jump. The next boss is the Troll Mother, and this could be awkward. With so many enemies, enemies, not being able to jump or juggle could make this boss extremely difficult. At the start of the fight, I wanted to get as much damage as I could on the Troll Mother before she started spawning in loads of enemies. I managed to get her health down to about half until it got too much. From here on out, I wanted to always be on the move so I couldn't get caught in the enemies. So I ended up running around the arena doing my dive attack. This allowed me to get some decent damage on the boss and also knock back the enemies. And after doing this for a little bit, the Troll Mother was defeated. Next was the Mel chase scene, and I had completely forgotten about the logs that you have to jump over. Failing to jump over them will result in you taking some damage. So I ended up having to just tank the damage. This led us into the river where we had another big problem. In the river, you cannot do any attacks whilst in the water. Normally, you would jump out the water to do damage or jump on some floating debris, but we can't do that. So we had to figure out a way to do damage or get on one of these floating debris without pressing the jump button. We tried using the rocks to knock us onto the debris, we tried using the fish to knock us on the debris, we tried using different animal orbs to see if they could damage the enemies for us, but just nothing seemed to work. I had pretty much given up. Is it actually impossible to beat Castle Crashers without jumping? For a moment, it did seem like it, but that's when this happened. Wait, hold on. Wait a minute. Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh my god. You can do it without jumping. So you spawn into the level mid-air as you're falling, and for the brief moment whilst you're falling, you can use the fly combo to keep yourself in the air. I was then able to position myself over some floating debris and drop onto it. So all I had to do now was not take any damage or get knocked off. And there were many things that wanted to knock me off this debris, but with some patience, we were finally able to make it to the catfish boss fight. And this boss fight is pretty easy. Almost every single attack can be blocked, so as long as you hold up your shield, you can't really be knocked off. All we had to do was avoid the catfish as he's swimming towards us, and after a while, the catfish was defeated. In the tall grass fields, our next boss fight was the bear. The only thing we had to look out for was Rami and the tornado. Not being able to jump meant avoiding these attacks was a little bit harder, but overall, the bear boss isn't a difficult fight and we quickly moved on to PP Straddle's cave. In the cave, we can find cave slimes. These enemies are extremely annoying as they have a lot of health and move away whenever you damage them. In my last challenge run video, I had a lot of people commenting that I was fighting them incorrectly. The most effective way to damage the slimes is by doing a dive attack. So this time I made sure to do it. Please don't shout at me. But this eventually led us on to PP Strello, and well, we all know how this boss goes. We were now level 10, meaning we could upgrade our weapon to the clunky mace. This weapon will give us a +5 to our strength, so a little bit better than the blacksmith's hammer. We soon moved on to the flowery fields, where I fought my own kind. But it's okay, I'm more of a peanut butter guy. And up on the wedding walls, I actually let the Grey Knights do something for once. And they actually managed to defeat the beefy conehead. Maybe these guys will finally be useful. And inside Wedding Crash, we fought my favourite enemies, the traffic cone. But this eventually led us to the groom, where I'm sure it'll be a fair fight. So round 2 with the conehead, and it honestly just feels like who could get their hit first. If you melee the groom first, you can keep him stun locked. If he hits you first, well... So making sure I struck first, it wasn't too bad as we could just keep the groom in a stun lock. Next was the carriage chase scene, and this actually posed an interesting challenge. Normally, you would just jump and hit the giant troll. You were able to stay floating in the air, doing infinite damage and avoiding all attacks. But of course, we couldn't do this. I instead had to use my projectile magic to damage the giant troll. This would have been easy if it wasn't for the constant thieves spawning. The thieves would either shoot shoot an arrow at me, melee me, or just get in the way. And if you didn't do damage to the giant troll, he will shoot a giant laser beam at you. This made the fight way more annoying than it needed to be, as I had to make sure I was damaging the troll whilst avoiding the thieves. And with each bead doing only 11 damage, it took quite a bit. But after being knocked off the carriage, we could enter our second cave, which means more cave signs. I think the only thing that could make this worse is coneheads. Why do I play this game? Why? Surely the worst of it is over. Next was the Cyclops boss fight, and this is a pretty easy one. The damage windows are quite large and it's very predictable, so all I had to do was dodge in and out of attacks, getting in my damage where I can, and of course blocking the throwing knives. Hey, it says Gutterbud under the lava. And this time for the second princess, we could actually save her. I'm sure the red princess made her way out. Next was Lava World, and the only real issue here were the fireballs that the fire demons threw, but apart from that, it wasn't too bad getting through here without jumping. But that can't be said for the skeletons, as for some reason, they all just ganged up on me. So on my second attempt, like the Troll Mother boss fight, I made sure to always stay on the move, doing my dive attack for damage. As long as I didn't stay still, the enemies couldn't do much, so one by one I defeated them and moved on to the first boss of Lava World. The Volcano boss fight requires you to be beefy in order to do damage, and as long as you are damaging the boss, it can't attack you, so the only real issue were the two fire demons. But I simply just went side to side of the volcano, doing damage when beefy until the first boss was down. Next was the dragon boss fight, which was quite an interesting fight. The dragon's head is quite high from the ground, meaning we can't do damage without jumping. Even my uppercut couldn't reach the dragon. So what I ended up doing was using the beekeeper's splash magic while stood underneath the dragon head. I was able to get short bursts of damage in, but I had to also avoid the dragon's fire as well as the boulder. And there was this very annoying fire demon who would constantly spawn. So after a lot of dead bees, the dragon boss was defeated. Next was Industrial Castle, and going through this without jumping was kinda rough. The elevator has a lot of enemies, and normally I would just get them in one big juggle. But without being able to juggle, I ended up getting a lot of bombs thrown at me. But after the elevator, we did have to go against the brute, who is always a problem in these kind of runs. But I came prepared. Using the bombs I bought from the item shop, I was able to place them as the brute was running into me. And since it was normal mode, the brute actually died extremely fast. So all that was left is the industrial machine. With this boss fight, there are 7 parts that you have to destroy. The 5 pillars in the middle, the turret, and the fingers. I always begin by destroying the 5 pillars in the middle, leaving only the turret and fingers left. I then use my uppercut attack since it has really good range. Although looking back at this footage, I'm not sure why I didn't just use my throwable magic. But anyway, the industrial machine was defeated and my chat decided the industrial prince's fate. Next was the desert, and I absolutely hate this place. If you've been following the No Start Insane mod, then you'll know that we are still stuck here. It's gotten so bad in fact that it's tainted the way I play, as I often forget that I can use my magic in the desert. But after fighting the worst enemy in the game, we got onto the UFO boss fights. And these bosses are the main reason why I picked Beekeeper. Since the UFOs are flying around, we can't really melee them without jumping. But luckily, the Beekeeper's magic can consistently hit enemies in the air. So after a lot of magic spam, both the UFOs were defeated and we could move into the mothership. And for the aliens, I once again stayed on the move using my dive attack, as if I stood still, I would probably get swarmed. But after defeating all the enemies, I had to escape the ship, and it was probably one of my smoothest ones yet. Go. Easy. Going down here at the bottom. Right, I'm not going to fail this. Easy. Oh, what a run. And after crashing the mothership, I stole some guy's camel and used it to get through the rest of the desert. This led us to our volleyball game, and using the uppercut, I was able to win 10-1. Next was the marsh, and I think the skeletons were rubbing it in. But at this point, we had leveled up our magic quite a lot, so when it came to dealing with a lot of beefy enemies, we ended up just magic spamming. So we magic spammed all our way to the second Troll Mother boss fight. Wait. Can we call this a boss fight since there's no health bar? What do you guys think? Is this a boss fight? Let me know in the comments below. But for the second Troll Mother, I once again just used my dive attack to make sure I was always on the move. So after defeating the Troll Mother, we went on to our next proper boss fight, the Corn Boss. The Corn Boss is just a really annoying fight. It has an insane amount of health and also small damage windows. But for this fight, if you stay near the bottom of the screen, you are able to dive attack, which kind of cheeses out the fight and causes you to do a lot of damage. So by repeating this cheese, I was able to defeat the Corn Boss, but hey, who doesn't love cheesy corn? Defeating the Corn Boss gave us the horn, which we can then use to unlock the gate for the next area. Here the level is flooded, making you run extremely slow in the water. So the only real issue with this level was dealing with the slowness. And it really is a shame that there's just no animal orb that can help increase your movement speed in water. So we slowly made our way to the next boss fight, that being Medusa. For the Medusa boss fight, as long as you stay close to her, she can't really do much. One of her snakes will melee you, but this can be blocked. So I simply did damage in between blocking the snake, and very quickly, Medusa was defeated. We moved on to Full Moon, which has 4 beefy stole faces. By running to the bottom of the slope, the beefy will try and follow you. This causes them to get stuck, and in this state, they are unable to damage you. I repeated this for all the beefies, and soon enough, we were onto ladder strat. By using the ladders, I was able to group all of the enemies together, allowing me to damage all the enemies at the same time. Repeat this by going up and down the ladders, and soon enough, we made it onto Snow World. Now, Snow World is kinda like the desert. I don't like it. It isn't as bad as the desert, it's just an annoying area. The enemies love to throw snowballs, which make a weird squelching sound. There are a lot of these ice barriers which actually have a lot of health. And of course, there are just a lot of enemies. Now it's nowhere near as bad as desert, but it's still not a fun area. But just like the area, the boss isn't too fun either. So the next boss is the Frost King, and he likes to teleport a lot, leaving us with very small damage windows. And to make things worse, my chat really wanted me to use the ice sword just to make me suffer that little bit more. So for most of the boss fight, I would use my dive attack, as this allowed me to get consistent damage in between teleports. I repeated this up until the final phase of the boss fight, where his teleports become a lot more frantic. I decided to switch to my splash magic, as it gave me a lot more range, allowing me to do damage before he teleported. And just like that, the Frost King was defeated. We saved the 3rd princess with an uppercut, so that's 2 out of 4 princesses saved. Let's check in on Red Princess. Oh hey, that's the final princess. Wait, no, I can't jump. What am I going to do? So the first boss fight in this area is going to be the Painter. And for the Painter, we just focused all of our damage when he came down. And any paintings he would spawn, we just let them hit us. We had quite a lot of defense at this point, so them paintings weren't doing too much damage. So I repeated this until the Painter came down for his final phase, and all I had to do was avoid the paintings whilst doing dive attacks into the Painter. And after enough dive attacks, the Painter went down and we could move on to the second boss. For the second boss, we do our damage in between the casket's wings. Then we simply avoid the fireballs, and then of course, PP ground strap. We now repeat this until the Cyclops boss finally dies. So the first 2 bosses were pretty easy, but the same could not be said for the third. That's because we're going to have to defeat the Necromancer without jumping. And for the Necromancer himself, that's not bad. In fact, it's pretty easy. The real problem is the enemies before. We have to fight 2 waves of enemies, with one of them including 3 beefies. On my first attempt, I only had 1 healing potion, since this was straight from the other 2 bosses. So I died at the beginning of the second wave, but I wasn't too worried since I could try it again with full healing potions. So after fighting my way back to the Necromancer, I gave it a second go. But on my second go, I didn't even make it to the beefies since the Fire Demon did this. On my 4th attempt, I changed to the Bear Club, which is one of the best weapons in the game. It gives a +5 to strength and a +5 to defense. something I desperately needed in this fight. And on my 4th attempt, I actually did it. There's not much I could say on what succeeded in this fight compared to the other 3, mainly just having full healing potions and the bear club. There wasn't really a strategy I used, I kinda just spammed melee and magic hoping I won. This meant we could now fight the necromancer himself. And if you're familiar with Castle Crashers or any other challenge runs I've done, you would know this is extremely easy. The necromancer himself is probably one of the easiest bosses in the game, since all but one attack can be blocked. So after 4 attempts, the necromancer was defeated and we could move on to the final boss. There are 6 phases to the final boss fight. The first phase involves destroying these 4 crystals. I waited for them to land so I could melee them, but if they were in the air, I was actually able to use my magic to damage them as well. For the second phase, the wizard will come down and have 2 coloured bubbles. The blue bubble means you can only damage him with magic, and the red bubble is only melee damage. So depending on the colour of his bubble, I either damaged him with my magic or my melee. The third phase, the wizard floats in the air as this ball, and since I couldn't jump up to melee him, I simply just used my splash magic so the bees would fall and hit him. For the 4th phase, he's once again flying, just a little bit bigger. But this phase was actually easier since he had a bigger hitbox, meaning my damage was more consistent. The 5th phase is once again the flying ball phase. And finally, the 6th phase we fight the wizard one-on-one. He will use a sword to summon meteors from the sky, and I couldn't really do much as he would jump in the air, meaning I couldn't hit him. So I pretty much just ran around the entire arena, avoiding the meteors and doing my dash attack whenever I could. It definitely took a while, but it was easy, consistent damage, and eventually the evil wizard was defeated. So we've beaten Castle Crashers with the bow, we've beaten it with the horn and shovel, so now it's time to beat the game using only bombs. And strap in because this has some of the highest highs and lowest lows out of any challenge run I've done so far. Now of course this challenge would be impossible to do using only the bombs from shops since you're only allowed 9 of them. So we are going to choose a character that does throw bombs as part of their magic, and for this it's going to be the Conehead. I don't know if you know this, but the Coneheads do throw bombs. So to begin this run, as always, we've got to defend the castle from the barbarian, and our bombs are actually doing 17 damage. For early game that is huge, but after defending this little shop here I went to go change my pet to the beholder as it will give us a +4 to our magic damage, as well as going getting Hattie's sword, which will give a further +3 magic boost as well, meaning we are now going to hit for 34 damage plus fire damage afterwards. Surely nothing can go wrong, right? We pretty quickly came across our first boss of the run, which is this battering ram, and to no one's surprise we breezed through it. And soon we came across the second boss of the run, which is the barbarian boss. Once again, nothing too difficult here, and we even got to practice on our throwing hand. So unsurprisingly, since we are literally throwing bombs at our enemies, we are breezing through these stages. And honestly, there isn't much to talk about during these stages, it's just a lot of bomb throwing and waiting on the magic to recharge. So less than 20 minutes into the run and we're already on the Troll Mother boss fight. And who do you think would win? The Troll Mother and her babies living in the forest, or... Moving on to the river area of the game, and once again we do have a bit of a problem. I'm starting to notice a theme with the river, as it's always a problem in these kind of runs. And this time it was the bats, as they had a really strange hitbox. So you had to throw the bombs to the left of the bats and that's where it would hit them. But by the time I properly figured it out, I was low on health and did unfortunately die. But I did use this opportunity to go restock my healing potions and also buy some bombs from the shop. So we jumped back into the river to give it another go, and you can just see how annoying these bats hitboxes were. Next was the catfish fight, and very annoyingly we couldn't actually destroy the furball to do a proper damage phase. This meant all of our damage on the catfish was when it had its very high damage resistance, meaning that we were only hitting for 8 damage per bomb. So it took quite a few damage phases to defeat this catfish, but towards the end this happened. Yes, sorry. Did I just destroy... Dude, I just destroyed the furball as we killed him. That's crazy. So of course on my last bomb it destroyed the furball, meaning we could have done normal damage without the resistance. So I was pretty annoyed after wasting quite a lot of time on this boss, so I decided to go bully some bears to release some stress. The Industrial Revolution and its consequences. Moving into the cave, and the slimes actually weren't that bad, and soon enough we went against my favourite boss in all of the game, that of course being PP Strello. As tradition on this channel, we of course have to glitch him out at least once. Never change PP Strello. never change. Of course, this boss fight was a breeze, so we could move on to the flowery field. What a lovely field full of nature and flowers. Are they bees pollinating the area? Wait, no. Conehead, don't throw bombs. Conehead, no, why? On the wedding part of the game, we could finally get our revenge on the other Coneheads and give them a taste of their own medicine. Man, this felt good. I can finally show them all the pain and suffering they've been giving us Castle Crasher players for years. But moving up to the Groom boss fight, we actually did a lot of damage, but unfortunately, so does the Groom. So after getting Beybladed on, I went to the shop to get some more healing potions and did it all again. But this time, I defeated the Groom using only bombs, and honestly, there's just something so poetic about that. Next was the carriage fight with the giant troll, and as you can imagine, it was extremely easy. But what wasn't easy was the next cave section. So when you think of the most annoying enemies, who do you think of? Maybe the Coneheads because of their bomb throwing and heavy juggles? Maybe they're thieves because of their tendency to run away and shoot arrows? Could it be the cave slimes who have a lot of health and make it very difficult to hit them? Well, ding ding ding, because they are the 3 enemies we are fighting next. Behemoth, was it a bad day at the office? What was this? But after going through that hell, surely it was going to be easy from here. Luckily though, it is just more Coneheads, so you just got to deal with the heavy juggling and the bombs, but just get through it and it'll be okay. Oh, and did I mention that fire demons have a massive resistance to bombs? That's 8 damage. That is the number 8. And they have 200 health. Luckily though, it is only 1, and I'm sure there's not going to be that many later on in the future. Next was the Cyclops boss fight, and as long as you can get the timing down, this fight is not too bad. The Cyclops is very predictable and provides large damage windows, so as long as you're patient, you can get this boss down pretty easily. Oh hey, there's a massive lava pit in the middle of this arena. Cyclops, watch out for the lava pit. Oh no guys, he has AirPods in. What has this channel become? Next was Lava World, and oh, Lava World. So as mentioned earlier, fire demons have a big damage resistance to the bombs, meaning we're only hitting them for 10 damage. And with them having 200 HP, that means it takes about 20 bombs per fire demon. And trust me, there are a lot of fire demons in Lava World. So after getting to about halfway through Lava World, I did unfortunately die and I had to redo it all over again. And there are no checkpoints in Lava World. You start from the very beginning, even if you die on the second boss fight. Yeah, second boss fight, there are 2. But for the first boss fight, it is actually a gimmick boss, meaning you can only damage it with the sandwiches. However, if you throw a bomb and then immediately eat a sandwich, you can actually do damage with that bomb. But that damage is kinda terrible. And trust me, we did a lot of testing on this and it is close to impossible to get this done. On paper, yes, you can technically beat this boss using only bombs, but in practice, it will take an extremely long time and a high skill window. And I have one of them. You can guess which one. But luckily, the second boss can be damaged with bombs. But with that being said, of course the final boss had to have damage resistance to bombs too. And guys, I'll be honest, this was rough. A boss that only takes 7 damage per bomb, a fire demon that will never go away, it will always be there, and a massive boulder that would constantly drop down that I had to dodge. This was a real test of endurance and skill, but eventually I was able to defeat the final boss of Lava World and progress from this area. Next was Industrial Castle, and this area is actually regarded as one of the more difficult areas of the game, but after what I've just been through, this was like the gift from Behemoth. 67 damage per bomb. Lava World made me forget I was actually quite OP at this point. And I forgot to mention, but we went and grabbed the Unicorn Horn, which gives a +6 to magic damage. So +6 from the horn and +4 from the beholder means a +10 to magic overall. That is huge. So this meant that the Industrial Machine was a complete breeze, as this boss fight kind of relies on you having some range, as melee damage isn't very optimal. So after defeating the Industrial Machine comes a very important choice. Does the Industrial Prince live or die? And going off my recent poll, a lot of you guys really want him to die. However, my chat was actually 50-50 on this decision, so it went down to a coin flip, and he lived. Maybe he'll go start that charity. And after a quick boat trip across the ocean, which had a bit too much bomb sounds going on, So we landed in the desert area, which is one of my least favourite areas in the game. However, we were actually quite strong at this point, doing a lot of damage and melting a lot of enemies, meaning it didn't take long until we came across the UFO boss fights, and we were chunking the health bar. To no one's surprise, the inside of the alien ship was extremely easy, and actually what was surprising was beating the escape scene first try. In fact, things were really looking up in this run. We were melting enemies and breezing through all parts of the game, so there was nothing that could really bring me down. Never mind. Next was the marsh level, which we were hitting for 85 plus 22 fire damage. Our bombs were hitting for over 100 damage. So you could imagine when we came across the troll mother for a second time, well, we gave her that Oppenheimer treatment. Next was the corn boss fight, which is regarded as one of the most annoying bosses in all of the game, but was surprisingly not that bad with this build. It still took quite a long time to defeat the corn boss because no matter what you do, it's always going to take a long time. So the corn boss eventually died and we were rewarded with the horn, allowing us to move on to the next area of the game. And honestly, there's not too much to say. 99 damage per bomb and we were just shredding the area. So for the Medusa boss fight, once again we were chunking the health bar and not really struggling, but if you didn't know, you could actually knock her own snakes back at her to do 20 damage. So we decided to try and finish her off with one of her own snakes, and after getting the correct timing, the Medusa boss finally died. Next was the full moon level, which is regarded as one of the hardest non-boss areas of the game. And to begin this level, we've got to go through 3 beefy enemies. These are especially annoying because you can't juggle them and they're also extremely aggressive, so meleeing them is pretty difficult. But since we had bombs that could be shot from a distance and did an insane amount of damage, there was zero struggle here. And a little further up, we actually didn't use ladder strats. I think this is the first time in any of my challenge runs where I actually never used this strat, which just goes to show how strong this build was because you almost need to use a ladder strat to get past this part. And for the ice section a little further ahead, the hardest part was destroying the ice that the Eskimos was hiding behind. As we were hitting the Eskimos for 72 damage per bomb, it meant it took longer to destroy the ice versus the enemy, meaning it didn't take long at all until we was on the Frost King's boss fight. Similar to the corn boss, the Frost King is regarded as a very annoying boss since he has the tendency to only appear for a few seconds before teleporting away, meaning your windows for damage are pretty small. On top of that, he also freezes you, meaning that you have to avoid being frozen to get your damage to begin with. We were hitting for 86 per bomb, so damage was not an issue. So soon enough, the Frost King was defeated and we saved the princess. Moving on to the final part of the game, and do you remember at the start of the video when I said that this has the highest highs and lowest lows? Well, here's the lowest low of the run. So the cult minions have a 100% immunity to my bombs, meaning no matter what level I am or how much magic I have, I will always do 1 damage per bomb. And the cult minions have 190 health. So doing the math, that meant we had to hit 190 bombs per cult minion. There are 12 cult minions to kill here. So that means we got to do 12 and times it by 190, and that equals 2,280. That is how many bombs we have to throw to kill all the cult minions. And that's assuming every bomb we throw will hit, which was definitely not the case. So this, no joke, took me over an hour to do. That's right, I sat there and threw bombs doing 1 damage for over an hour. So if you haven't already, a like on the video will go a long way as it would help fund me for my therapist. So after a painstaking amount of time, we make it onto the first of the 4 final bosses. The first boss was the painter boss, which actually wasn't too bad. All we had to do here was burst damage the boss with our bombs and destroy the paintings with our bombs too. This meant we didn't have to sacrifice our health in order to destroy the paintings since we did a lot of ranged damage. So 1 down, 3 to go. The Undead Cyclops was our second boss, and this was actually a lot easier than the painter. If we got high enough, we could actually avoid the damage from the boss and just keep spamming our bombs, meaning we could do very consistent fast damage and avoid taking damage. And during the invincible parts of the fight, you already know we're on that PP ground strat, looking like a traffic cone over here. So 2 bosses down, 2 to go. So the Necromancer fight, which is notorious for being the hardest boss fights in all of the challenge runs I do, was actually not bad at all. Since we had bombs that did a lot of damage and also stunned enemies such as the beefies, all we had to do was stay high in the sky and just spam the bombs. This would do quite a bit of splash damage down below as well as stunning the beefies, reducing the chances of being picked up and thrown. The only real problem during this fight was the fire demon, as once again he had a massive damage resistance to our bombs. And after our first try, we actually defeated all of the enemies, and the necromancer himself was so easy. I think this could be classed as bullying. This has never happened in any of the challenge runs I've ever done. I really struggled on the cult minions getting to these bosses, but then found the bosses themselves really easy. And this is why I love doing these challenges on Castle Crashers, because it really changes up the game. But who knows, maybe the final boss will actually be hard for once. Nope, 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 and nope. Yeah, so to no one's surprise, the final boss was a complete pushover. But I mean, look at the dude, he's literally a floating ball. After defeating the final boss, we land on the crystal, catch the princess, and ride it all the way back to the castle. And all we had to do to end the run was kiss the orange princess. Can you beat Castle Crashers without leveling up? Is it possible to go through the entire game without spending a single skill point? Let's find out. The run starts with us celebrating in the king's castle until a mysterious sorcerer comes and steals the king's crystal. The king however needs his bath salts, so he gets sent out to retrieve the crystal. Now the king's castle is under siege by barbarians, but luckily we have a wooden spoon. Now for this run, the beginning of the game was a breeze since it's intended to be done at level 1, so we flew through each stage and bought some healing potions at our first shop. Immediately after clearing the first area, I went and picked up Snooty, who will give us a +4 to our strength stat, as well as went and grabbed a weapon which gives a +2 to strength. Now is the perfect time to explain the rules of the run. The first rule is the run can only be completed without leveling up a single stat, and the second rule is we can only use weapons that are level 1. And finally, pets are allowed. With Snooty and our new weapon, we went to go continue the siege in the castle. It wasn't long until we came across our first boss, the enemy battering ram. Since it was the first boss of the game, it wasn't really a challenge, so after a lot of spamming attacks in the air, the battering ram eventually fell. And soon after we go against our second boss, the barbarian boss. Once again, with it being an early game boss, it wasn't too difficult, and with a lot of jump spamming, the boss eventually died. Now would be a good time to mention, you may notice that we are not the number level 1. This is because we cannot stop ourselves from leveling up. However, since we are not spending any skill points in the skill tree, we still remain the stats of a level 1. Moving on, we eventually make our way into the forest, but once again, it's still very early game, so when we came to our third boss, it wasn't too difficult to take down as well. And one quick chase scene later, and we eventually moved on to the catfish fight. Now at this point, it was beginning to become noticeable the lack of damage we were doing, so the catfish fight took a lot longer than usual. However, the fight itself is not too difficult as long as you are good at dodging and playing it safe. For the fourth boss fight, it was not too difficult as we are able to juggle this fight. Juggling is a very important mechanic in Castle Crashers as it allows you to dish out a lot of damage whilst taking very little to no damage yourself. It's something that I'm going to rely upon a lot during this run. However, some enemies and a lot of bosses cannot be juggled, and that is where it gets very difficult in this run. Moving on to the bat boss fight, this again wasn't too difficult as it was just a simple rinse and repeat of getting your damage in whilst avoiding the attacks. We then went and harvested some honey humanely from some bees, and then immediately went and crashed a wedding. God, commentating over this game is strange. Now the groom boss fight is where the game really ramps up in difficulty. The groom can dish out a lot of damage very fast, and if you are not careful can get instantly killed. However, you can also stun lock the groom, so using a lot of careful timing and patience, I was able to whittle the health down of the groom. However, I just managed to defeat the groom after almost dying near the end. Moving on to the carriage section of the game, anyone who jumped on top of the carriage was getting thrown off, so that wasn't very difficult. And for the troll boss fight, we managed to actually one phase him, which was very surprising, but at the same time he is one big meaty hitbox. So moving into the Cyclops castle area, this is where we can see some enemies that cannot be juggled, so the difficulty of these fights have gone up dramatically, which also meant clearing each stage was taking a much longer time. And on top of that, these enemies had a tendency of staying behind and throwing bombs, potions, which would constantly knock me down and ruin any rhythm. And by the time I got to the Cyclops boss fight, I had no healing potions as well as having very little health, but luckily for this fight it is not too difficult to dodge attacks as well as getting some good damage. So it took a while, but I was able to eventually get the boss into his enraged mode, which increases how often he attacks. So once again, with even more patience, we eventually able to get the boss to die. Moving on to Volcano World, it's a bit of an interesting area because the enemies can be juggled, but at the same time they do a lot of damage. But I was able to push through to the Volcano boss fight, which wasn't too difficult as he's more of a gimmick boss fight to introduce the sandwich mechanic, so all I had to do was really dodge his fireball attacks and the boss finally died. For the dragon boss fight, this was a lot closer than I would have liked it to be. I originally started off with this sandwich strat of getting a lot of hits in very fast by using the sandwich mode. However, the trade-off for doing this amount of damage was constantly getting attacked by his fire breath, so after running out of healing potions and almost dying, I played a lot more carefully, only getting in my damage when I could and backing off before the fire breath attack. But I actually got a very clutch level up, which increases your health to full again, so with a full health bar I was able to finish off the dragon boss fight. Next was the Industrial Castle, which is notorious for being a run killer. The enemies here dish out a lot of damage as well as having some of the best magic in the game, but after playing very carefully and defeating the very difficult enemies, I was able to move on to these traps, which are very easy and everyone should be able to get past first try. So after clearing the traps first try, I moved on to the elevator part of this run, which when I did my bow only challenge was very difficult as there's a lot of enemies in a very condensed area. But since I was no longer confined to a bow, I was able to introduce all of these enemies to the juggle corner. And soon after the elevator, we came across the first proper roadblock of the run. So there are these giant enemies that spawn from time to time, and this specific one has armor, so he is very tanky. Giants have the ability to pick you up and throw you, which do a lot of damage as well as stunning you. And on top of that, this giant specifically is very aggressive. He likes to always be in your face. This meant that fighting him in hand-to-hand combat wasn't really going to be effective. So I tried using my bow and arrow for a bit of range, but yeah, one damage is not gonna cut it, and I unfortunately died. I decided to try the boomerang on the giant, so I went on a different character to go grab it really quickly, and then ran through the industrial castle again. And for a little bit, the boomerang seemed to work, however the timing had to be close to perfect, as if you messed up with your timing, you could take damage and die. And that is exactly what happened. So I went to go restock on my healing potions and run through the industrial castle again. But whilst on the elevator, I was struggling to get the juggle corner going, as convincing the enemies to join in wasn't going to work, and I very quickly got attacked by multiple enemies at once and died. This really shows how easy it is to die in this level 1 run, as if you get stun lapped by a single enemy, you can just die straight away. I eventually decided to change to Snail Burr, as it will give us a massive increase to our defense. This meant I had more room for error as I could take more hits. However, I was doing a lot less damage now without Snooty, so this meant that each area was going to take a little longer. And for the boss fight of this run, I ran out of healing potions, so I didn't really have any room for error. However, this boss fight is very annoying as it kind of relies on range, as you cannot step on the red grates. So since I did very little damage, it took a long time to defeat each section of this boss. However, another clutch level up came in, so I managed to get all of my health back, and after a lot of patience, I was able to finally defeat the Industrial Castle. I let my chat decide what they wanted to do with the Industrial Castle's prince, and every single one of them voted him to die. So after a 360 no scope, I got the golden telescope and was able to progress to the next area of the game. And after one very fast boat trip across the ocean, we landed in the desert area. Now this area of the game really slowed down the pace of things even more, as there's a nice mix of enemies here who can't be staggered and will also grab you, enemies that will go underground and become invulnerable for a certain amount of time, as well as the regular enemies not being able to be juggled. It took a while, but eventually we made it to the aliens. Now the aliens I thought was going to be the make or break of this run, as there are a lot of them that do quite a bit of damage, but they also have no health and could be defeated in one shot. So this meant it was going to be a 50-50 of this part of the game being very difficult or very easy. But since the aliens could be juggled, it ended up being very easy, so luckily the alien section was not too bad. And it was at this point during the streaming of this run that my channel hit 1000 subscribers. And I would just like to take a minute to thank every single one of you for subscribing to my channel and supporting a small creator like me. It really means a lot to me that people are coming to my videos, watching them, giving me feedback, and just generally being very positive about everything. So thank you to every single one of you for the support, and I promise I will keep striving to make better and more quality content. Back to the run, I ended up crashing the alien ship and stealing some guy's camel, and after riding all my way to the sandcastle, I reached the second big roadblock of the run. Not surprisingly, the second roadblock was another giant enemy, so after dying to this part of the game, I went and restocked my healing potions and tried again. To try and take down this giant, I decided to use the boomerang strat, which is very effective against giants. However, it kind of needs to be done in a 1v1 situation. When there are other enemies there, it makes it a lot harder to get the timing correct between the boomerang and attacks, which just leaves more room for error. But right after struggling to defeat this giant, we get bombarded with 2 more giants plus 3 smaller enemies. This was going to test my patience. Luckily, however, these 2 giants were very slow compared to the rest of the enemies, so I was able to train them around to make some separation and focus on defeating the smaller guys first. And after dwindling down the numbers a bit, I focused on doing some damage to these giants. I figured out that hitting a giant 4 times whilst in the air will cause them to fall over, as well as just hitting them whilst in the air will cause them to stagger on the spot. So this gave me a method to safely attack the giants without risking taking damage from them, as well as still keep moving from the other enemies that are around the giants. So by using this strat, I was able to eventually dwindle down all the enemies and defeat this area. And for the next area, I had no healing potions, so I had to play very carefully. But these enemies decided they wanted to do this tornado attack, which was very hard to avoid, but I just barely managed to scrape past and get to the end volleyball section with a sliver of health left. And for the volleyball section, you can't take damage, so as long as you... What was that? Game, what was that? And we're back. I decided to repay the favour to the enemies in our rematch, and after scoring 10 points in the game, I won the map. The map unlocks us the next section of the game, which is going to get a lot more difficult now. Moving into the next area, we get a great example of the difficulty increase. Luckily, however, these 4 giants have less health than the regular giants, but still, it's not an easy fight. Being able to juggle these enemies really was the saving grace, as it just makes a massive difference. Soon we come across the mini troll boss fight again, except this time he isn't a boss. But juggling all of his babies, it wasn't too difficult. And soon enough, we come on to the biggest troll fight of this game. For some reason, there's this corn boss fight which just completely comes out of nowhere. And for whatever reason, the developers decided to make this corn boss fight have an insane amount of health. No, really, I believe that the corn has the most health out of any boss in the game. On top of that, he has many moves which make it so you get knocked down and can't damage him, as well as just avoiding you a lot of the times. This results in an extremely long and boring boss fight. Mix that with a level 1 only run and you can see just where this is going. And after about 20 minutes, I unfortunately died near the end of the fight, so I had to redo it again. Moving on to the next area of the game, we come across these Murloc enemies, which are kind of annoying because they have this little jump move which you can't damage them from, but they are not too difficult, so once again it was just a patience test. And these guys have the coolest death animations, but after fighting my way through a lot of them, I eventually came across the Medusa boss fight. Now, I was originally really struggling with this boss fight because if you get too close to her, one of her snakes will bite you and it's very difficult to avoid, so I couldn't really figure out a strategy to get good damage on her. I tried shooting my arrows at her, I tried juggling her babies back at her, but nothing just seemed to work. However, I actually figured out a really cool hidden secret within Castle Crashers that I guarantee not a single player knows. The block button. That is right, in Castle Crashers you can actually stop and block damage. But with this revolutionary new find, I was able to block the damage of the snake and get very consistent damage. And it didn't take long, but the Medusa boss fight finally was defeated. But soon I came across our very first proper roadblock. And I mean, we were stuck on this part for a long time. So not surprisingly, it was another giant enemy. However, this giant had a big suit of armor that made it so he took very little damage. On top of that, he hit like a tank. If you got caught by this guy, it was over. Plus he had his 2 minions following him, which made it very difficult to get any consistent damage. I tried using the boomerang strat, I tried using the bow and arrow strat, I tried using the throw yourself at him strat, and it all failed. So I was completely stumped. However, there is a pet that can do damage on his own. There are a few of these pets, but the one I was after is called Dragonhead. Dragonhead can be bought from the Insane Store, which is only unlocked once you beat the game on any character. However, there were two problems. First was Dragonhead only shot when you did damage to an enemy. The second one is the damage was awful, and I mean awful. Dragonhead, your one ability is to do damage. What do you mean it's a kid game? I decided to fully go into the archery build, so I got Meowbert as well as the wooden spoon, which gave the biggest increase to our archery skill. So this was the most damage that the bow and arrow could do, and by doing this, I surprisingly defeated the giant and cleared the first stage of this level. So we can finally progress to the next part of So after a while, we finally cleared all of the giants. Now the next part of this area was kind of the opposite of the giants because the enemies were easier, but there was a lot of them. However, a new strat was born this day. I'd like to call this one the ladder strat. But essentially, if I climbed up these ladders and then climbed back down them, all of the enemies would group together, allowing me to get easy damage on all the enemies at once. This worked, but unfortunately, since I put all of my specs into archery, I really struggled with the melee damage and unfortunately got overwhelmed. So I went back and respec'd fully into strength again. And I eventually made my way back to the ladders, used the ladder strat, and with the new strength I had, I was able to defeat all of the enemies. Next was the snow area, which was a massive breath of fresh air as these enemies could be juggled, so it was a lot easier than the previous section. In fact, we pretty much flew through this entire stage. And before I knew it, I was at the Ice King boss fight. Now I changed my pet for Yeti here as he actually makes it so you can't be frozen, and during this fight, all of his attacks rely on you getting frozen. It was another pretty slow boss fight as he teleported a lot, leaving my DPS windows very small, but the actual fight itself wasn't too difficult. So yeah, it definitely took a while, especially slipping in all the ice, but eventually I managed to defeat him. And just like that, our third princess was saved. Still no sign of the king's bath salts, however. Oh wait, no, did I take him? Oh no. Whew. Anyway, we're now on to the final stage of the game. For the first of the 4 bosses was the painter boss fight. This is normally a very easy boss, but since I did very little damage, his paintings were a real problem. You see, you have to defeat his paintings in order for him to come down and draw more, allowing you to get a small window of DPS. Normally at this point in the game, you would have a lot more health, so you would just let the paintings explode on you and then you would do damage on the boss. But since I did very little damage and had very little health, that wasn't really an option. This left me stuck as I had to defeat the paintings each time, but it took a very long time to do so and was very easy to make mistakes. And once again, I tried many different strats. I tried using Snowball to tank the damage. I tried using Rami to attack the paintings. He did nothing, by the way, so thank you, Rami. I tried seeing if the sandwiches made a difference. The boomerang did nothing, and pretty much nothing seemed to work. However, I think I just got a very lucky run as I was able to get the boss's health low enough to where he came down for the last part of the fight, but since I took so much damage from all the paintings earlier, I had very little health and no healing left. So for this part of the fight, I had to dodge all of the paintings as being touched by one would have ended it whilst trying to get damage in on the boss. It definitely took a while, but eventually I was able to defeat the first of the 4 bosses. And for the second fight, I didn't buy any healing potions as I was very confident, as I knew that I could dodge the Cyclops' attacks very easily as well as get consistent easy damage. And I was right, it's a very easy fight, just dodge when you have to dodge and attack when you can get damage in. Definitely the easiest of the 4 fights. However, moving on to the third fight and... oh god. The Necromancer fight. Now, everyone knew at the start of this run that the Necromancer fight was the make or break. And even I knew this fight was not easy. In fact, it took me over 2 hours to complete. The problem was, before you even fight the Necromancer himself, there are 2 phases of enemies you have to go through. He will spawn in every enemy that you fought in the game from start to now, plus some giants for good measure. This meant you had to fight a good mixture of enemies that can be juggled, enemies that can't be juggled, enemies that threw bombs. It was just a real mess. It got to a point where I was running out of money to buy healing potions for each run, so I had to go back and do some earlier bosses to get money for healing. In the actual fight, I was able to get past the first phase pretty easily, but once that second phase hit, oh boy. But eventually, after 2 hours, I finally got the run, and I could finally fight the actual boss of this stage. Funnily enough, the boss fight is very easy. By using my new hidden ability, the block button, this fight felt more like Elden Ring than Castle Crashers, and is probably one of the most intense fights in the entire game, as it isn't just jumping and attacking, it actually is a bit tactical. You have to plan your attacks and plan your blocks, like I was in tryhard mode. But eventually, the Necromancer finally died, and we can finally move on to the last boss of this run. Now the final boss will have 5 different phases, and the first phase is very trivial. There are 4 crystals and all you have to do is destroy them when they land. So once you get past that stage, you actually fight the boss himself. His first phase is easy, just a little slow. So he will get 2 different bubbles around him. First is his blue bubble, which means you can only damage him using magic. Yeah, level 1 magic isn't going to cut it. But luckily he has a red bubble which you can attack him with any other attack. So after a while of waiting between bubbles, I eventually defeated the second phase. And moving on to the third phase, it's a bit of a meme. You pretty much just stand and hit him. It's not very difficult at all. And for his fourth phase, he turns into a giant spider-like creature. But once again, it's pretty easy, as all you gotta do is jump up and hit him, and then once he attacks, just move out of the way. The only real problem is the enemies on the floor that would like to get a cheeky hit on you every now and then, but it wasn't too difficult. His fifth phase is just a meme again, just stand and hit him. And then finally you are on his sixth phase. For this part, you actually fight him one-on-one, and he will use his sword which can summon meteors as well as do a swirly attack. But once again, it's just a waiting game, as the fight itself isn't difficult, it just takes a little bit. You don't really want to be standing still during this fight at all, as you can get caught by a meteor, so the strat is to just run in circles, and then once he lands, do a dive attack to get some damage on him and repeat. And after a little bit, the boss finally fell. The whole floating structure that we're on falls, but luckily we land on the king's bath salts as well as save the last princess. We ride it all the way back to the castle, and finally we can end this run. And one final check to make sure we didn't have any stats during any point of this run. So everyone here has probably at least played Castle Crashers a few times, and maybe even played the game in unconventional ways, but I can almost guarantee not a lot of people have beaten the game using only the shovel and horn. Now for this run to be possible, we're going to have to play on a character that has already beaten normal mode so we can unlock the horn. So I went with the Red Knight, as he has maxed out strength as well as maxed out defense. But to make the challenge a little bit more difficult, as that's what we like to do around here, I was allowed no pet and only a level 1 weapon that provided no stat buffs. And with everything set up, we can now start this run. So a fun little interaction with the shovel and horn is that the shovel actually can hit enemies twice, once when you stick it into the ground and once when you flick it up, meaning the shovel is going to be our best damage source. However, the horn has slightly a bit more range, so you can actually be outside the melee range of most enemies, as well as it having a lot of vertical range. So this gave us 2 different choices of damage depending on the scenario. And it's at this point in the run we learned something really interesting. For him to start shooting. Wait, did I just crit with a shovel? Okay. So you can hit crits with both the shovel and the horn. So one problem that we ran into quite a bit was there is a delay when you actually attack and the attack happens, meaning you have to get the timing of your attacks pretty perfect or else you can get hit out of it. It wasn't long until we came across our first boss, and since we did have max strength and max defense, it wasn't actually too bad as we were chunking it with the shovel. Shovel strat is OP. I'm sure it was just a fluke though, it's the first boss after all. So it turns out that the shovel and horn damage actually scales with your character's strength, and since we had a lot of it, we were doing a lot of damage to these early game bosses. However, this wouldn't last long, as later on in the game the enemies have a lot more health and do a lot more damage, so it wasn't always going to be this easy. But anyway, we rescued the first princess. Now moving on to the Thieves' Forest was a really annoying area, since thieves have the tendency to keep their distance and shoot arrows at you, and well, since all of our damage sources relied on getting as close to the enemy as possible, this ended up being quite annoying. long. Eventually we made it onto the Troll Mother boss fight, and this boss was pretty annoying. So as you expect, a boss that summons a lot of enemies isn't going to be easy for this challenge. And well, we pretty much spent the entire fight having to run around in circles and get 1 or 2 attacks off on the boss. And by attacks I mean blowing my horn at her. Once again, the horn just had a slight bit more range than the shovel, which allowed us to get more consistent damage on a lot of the bosses and enemies in the game, as it just gave us that extra split second to avoid melee damage. But after a little while we defeated the Troll Mother boss fight and could move on to the next section. The river section was a bit of a problem since we had to be standing on a floating object in order to just use our utility, and the little bats that came were a proper nuisance. And that's because they would latch onto your head, and normally you would spam the melee attack button to get them off, but that wasn't allowed for this run. This meant we pretty much just had to let them attack us until we would get knocked off our raft, which would also kill the bat. It took a while, but eventually we got to the catfish fight. So in this run, any boss that has a damage phase where you're guaranteed not to get hit would mean that we would use the shovel for this, because we could get the most DPS as well as be safe from being knocked out of it. So this meant that during the damage phase, all we had to do was use the shovel until the boss finally died. Next was the tall grass section, where we for some reason just decide to kill these bears. They didn't really kidnap the princesses or do anything, but we're gonna kill them for traveling through their land. How are we the good guys? I've seen what the king does. But here we learned something interesting about the shovel, and that is when you dig it into the ground, you do less damage than when you pull it out. So the first number hits for 25, but the second number hits for 30. If I had to guess, I would probably say that the first hit registers as a light attack and the second hit is a heavy attack, but I'm not too sure. Soon we came on to the next boss fight, and this one was very annoying. And that's because, well, the boss has Rammy, which will ram into you and knock you down, as well as having 3 other enemies that love to shoot arrows and spam magic at you. On top of that, the boss himself would also go into this tornado mode, which would knock you down if you touched it. So all of this, with a build that has a damage delay, meant it took quite a long time. But after running around in endless circles, we were eventually able to get the boss's health low enough to where we could finish him off. But after defeating the bear boss, we made our way into the caves and came across our next boss of the run, which I only recently learned had a name. And are you ready for this? Pipistrello. Pipistrello. Like, what? We somehow managed to glitch him again, like we do in every single run. So he just kind of stood there and took the damage as we shoveled him to death. Next was the flower fields, where we played some sweet symphonies for the bees. But I had to hurry through the fields and get into the wedding reception as I had a hot date lined up for me. So, do you come here often? First dates never work out. And well, if I can't find happiness, neither can this groom. And for the groom boss fight, it was very difficult to get a hit on him, as he would run around the arena like a madman and then just go shoot bombs. So I was really struggling just to get any damage. But when I eventually got that lucky hit and knocked him to the floor, it wasn't too difficult to keep him stun locked. And yeah, that's all we had to do, just get 1 lucky hit and stun lock him. So it didn't take long, but we eventually moved on to the carriage section of the game. And this is unfortunately where we meet our first roadblock of the run. And that is simply because the troll boss here is out of range for our shovel and horn, meaning we couldn't reach him to do any damage. I tried pretty much everything I could think of, and there was only one viable damage source. When the thieves will spawn in, there's a small chance they would shoot an arrow. Now I had to get the thief to spawn in on a specific side, shoot an arrow, I then had to dodge the arrow, and then it had to hit the boss. All of this worked for a measly 6 damage. Now according to the wiki, the troll has 500 HP in normal mode, and well, you do 500 divided by 6 and that equals 83.33. So we had to do that 83 times. So this is unfortunately the first boss of the run that is impossible to do with this challenge. But that's not going to stop us, so after swiftly defeating the troll boss by other means, it sure did take a while, but eventually we made it to the Cyclops boss fight. Now with every other challenge run I've done so far, the Cyclops was very easy, and that is because the Cyclops is very predictable and allows a large damage window. So all I had to do was shovel him and wait. So in the bow and arrow challenge we did, we found that you couldn't actually free the princesses with a sharp arrow, but you could with a horn. So next was Lava World, and as you could imagine, it wasn't fun. So the enemies here just do a lot of damage with their fireballs, and similarly to the thieves, they just like to stand back and spam it. So like in every challenge run, this area wasn't the most pleasant, but it can only get better from here, right? No. So we come across a lot of these skeletons that have super speed and do quite a lot of damage. damage. So it only cost a few brain cells and a bit of hair, but we made it to the next boss of the run. And this level was already bad enough as it is, so surely we got a nice easy boss? No. So like in every challenge run, this is a gimmick boss, and therefore you have to defeat it using the sandwich mode. This means for most of the challenge runs, including this one, it's physically impossible to defeat this boss. So to get past this part, we unfortunately did have to use the sandwich mode to defeat this boss. So after deciding that I am the honoured one, I then went on to the last boss of this level. And for the last boss of this level, it was surprisingly not too bad. For an entire level that's just annoying and a run killer, this boss is surprisingly easy. So as mentioned at the start of the run, the horn has insane vertical range, pretty much meaning that any boss that has a hitbox above our heads, the horn will hit. So all we had to do was stand underneath this dragon head here and just keep spamming sweet tunes. So with the dragon boss dead, we could get the golden wheel, meaning all we had to do is get one last item. And that item just so happened to be at the end of Industrial Castle. So the Industrial Castle is known as being once again another very annoying area, which is a common theme when your only source of damage is a horn and a shovel. But I gotta say, it wasn't actually that bad. It definitely did take a while, it wasn't fast by any stretch of the imagination, but in terms of actual difficulty, we got through it without any real problems. The only issue is, when we got to the final boss, we didn't have any healing potions. This meant that we unfortunately died. However, after buying more healing potions, I ran through all of the Industrial Castle again and made it to the boss once more. For this boss fight, the only real problem was the fingers here, and that is because the hitbox was a little bit wonky with the horn, so I had to get into a position that was slightly underneath the fingers in order for the horn to hit. So timing here was key, as if I'd made a mistake, it was very hard to recover. But after a while, I was able to defeat the final boss of the Industrial Castle, and I let my chat decide what to do with the prince. After being defeated and wanting to turn his life around, the prince could go away and start a charity, get married, and eventually start a family. So letting the prince live would allow him to right his wrongs and create a better life. So of course my chat wanted to... So whilst on the run, I ended up in the desert, which turned out to be a pretty annoying area, mainly because the enemies here have a lot of damage resistance, and on top of that you have the beetles that go underground and do constant damage and you're not able to do anything about it, plus enemies that don't have a great knockback. But that wasn't even the worst of it. So for the UFO boss fights, pretty much every single time I've played this game, it will only spawn a couple of aliens. But this time, these alien ships was churning them out. And for this run specifically, the aliens were not any fun because they like to keep their distance and shoot their blasters at you. This meant trying to thin the herd of the aliens was very difficult, but also trying to get damage on the UFOs was also a problem, making this the hardest encounter I've had with the alien ship. But surely on the alien ship would be easier. I was so wrong. So to start off this level, you had to defeat a massive wave of the aliens, and normally this would be easy since all of the aliens are one shot, but when you only have a shovel and a horn to do damage, it was pretty rough. But once I defeated all of them, I could finally escape the ship and move on. Okay, just a bad run. Let's just do all that again and give it another go. Okay, third time's the charm, let's give it another go. Have you ever heard of a game called Castle Crashers? I'm sure a bit of beach volleyball will cheer me up. I wish that was me right now. But the suffering doesn't end here, as later on we come across 4 giant skeletons as well as their little speedster friends. We did manage to defeat them however, but it wasn't without a great cost. We ended up using all of the healing potions, so later on in the level I did unfortunately die, meaning I had to rerun the entire area again. This is up there. Definitely one of the worst challenge runs we've done. It took a while, but we eventually made it to the Tromom again. So you have to refight this enemy, but this time it isn't classed as a boss fight, with a few more enemies sprinkled in there for good luck. So after spamming my horn, I actually defeated all of the enemies in the area, which meant we can finally move on to one of the most annoying bosses in the game. Now the corn boss for some reason has an unusual amount of health, and on top of that is very difficult to hit, and that is due to the corn boss constantly moving moving around the arena, as well as having attacks that will knock you down and also having moves that will completely negate any damage. But for some reason, I don't think the game expected anyone to defeat the Khorne with a shovel, so I was able to actually get quite a lot of consistent damage on the Khorne boss by just digging at it with a shovel. So it took a while like it always does, but surprisingly wasn't actually that bad. Shovel strat OP. For the Medusa boss fight, the shovel wasn't really going to work since she constantly scuffled away from you, so we had to use the horn for this fight. But for the boss itself, it was actually very easy since ever we figured out that there was a block button in Castle Crashers, all I had to do was block the snake whenever it attacked and then blow my horn. So after a little while, the Medusa boss finally died. Next was the Full Moon level, which I would normally say is the hardest non-boss level in the game, and that is the case for most runs, but surprisingly for this run, it actually wasn't. The giants were a little slow to kill, but wasn't that much of an issue. And for the next part, you already know what's going to happen. Ladder strat! That is right, the ladder strat makes a return for the third challenge run in a row. So for this version of ladder strat, what we do is climb down the ladder as normal to group all the enemies together, then use our horn to hit all of the enemies. Repeat this for 10 minutes and we make it into the snow area. Now for pretty much every challenge run, the snow area was always seen as a breath of fresh air. However, for this run, it was the complete opposite. And that is because the enemies here will constantly be throwing snowballs. On top of that, there are also the enemies that would just be coming at me as normal. This made it extremely difficult to get any damage on any enemies because if I got hit by one of these snowballs, it would cancel my attack. This meant each stage took me a very long time to complete, and by the time I reached the end of the level, I had no healing potions left and died. This happened over and over until eventually we finally got the run that passed this section. We eventually made it onto the Ice King boss fight, and similarly to the Khorne boss fight, it wasn't difficult, it just took a while. That is because the Ice King will throw off attacks and then teleport away, meaning a lot of the times you have to kind of guess where he's going to teleport to in order to get damage. And well, a shovel and horn isn't really the best weapon of choice. There is also ice on this level, which will cause your character to slide on the floor, making it harder to move around the map. So it took a while, but eventually the Ice King died and we saved the third princess. All that was left are the 4 final bosses. The first of the 4 bosses, being the painter boss fight, actually went pretty smooth. I originally tried using my horn to destroy the paintings, meaning I wouldn't take damage from them, but using the horn meant that my character stood still and I had to wait for the animation to finish before I could move again, meaning I pretty much couldn't avoid the paintings. Luckily, however, we had max defense, so the paintings didn't do that much damage. So as long as we had the healing potions, we could pretty much just tank the paintings and focus on damaging the boss. And when it came to damaging the boss, the shovel was the go-to choice here, as we could get 2 hits per attack rather than the 1 attack of the horn. And well, just repeat it over and over again until the boss finally dies. And for the second boss fight, you already know we abuse that PP ground strat. For the PP ground strat, you have to let the coffin hit you to go underground, essentially making you invincible so you can just wait out the entire groom phase. And when it came to actually damaging the boss, all we had to do was block his attack and hit him with a shovel. So 2 bosses down, 2 to go. Next is the Necromancer fight, and if you've seen the other challenge runs, then oh boy. So the Necromancer fight is easily one of the hardest boss fights in all of Castle Crashers, so doing it with only a shovel and horn was a bit scary. For my first attempt, I didn't have much healing left from the previous 2 bosses, so I just wanted to give it a test run to see how it went, and I died. So I went to buy some healing potions and gave it another go, and not surprisingly, died again. So as expected, it was very difficult to get any damage out with a horn and shovel since there were so many enemies coming at you, and I had to stand still and wait for an animation to play just to get any sort of damage. So this ended up with me running from each side of the room just to get 1 horn attack off. However, I quickly realized that this wasn't an effective method, as most of the times I couldn't get my attack off or would just take damage. But what I figured out is that there are some enemies in this room that will throw bombs, and these bombs can actually damage other enemies. So what I ended up doing was running back and forth all around the room and allowing these bomb throwing enemies to throw their bombs, and then I would try and bait enemies into them bombs and take damage. It took an extremely long time to do it, but eventually I was able to kill all the enemies. And well, for the actual Necromancer himself, like with every other challenge run, he was so much easier, and that is because every single damage move this guy has, apart from 1, can be blocked with a shield. So as long as you just hold down the block button, he can't damage you. On top of that, he doesn't have a great knockback resistance, so so one blow with my horn would send him in the air, meaning I could juggle him with my horn, and that is exactly what I did until the necromancer died. It was still a difficult fight, but nowhere near as bad as I thought it was going to be, so that meant there was only one last boss to end this run. For the final boss's first phase, the horn could actually damage and reach the crystals when they were in the air, so all I really had to do was follow the crystals around and blow my horn. Not a very difficult phase. For the second phase, he has two different coloured bubbles that he will switch from, the blue one meaning you can only damage him with magic and the red one being melee. So luckily the horn and shovel do count as melee damage, so all I had to do was wait for the red bubble and then get my damage on him, which was a little bit annoying because he was very fast and would constantly move when I was mid animation, but eventually I was able to get onto the third phase. Now the third phase was a complete joke. Since my horn has really good vertical range, all I really had to do was follow him around in a circle and blow my horn underneath him. Yeah, very easy phase. And same with the fourth phase, all I had to do was stand underneath and blow my horn. Except this time he does have spikes or legs, what are those? And he could hit you with them, but once again all I had to do was block with my shield. The fifth phase is the exact same as the third phase, just stand underneath and blow my horn. The sixth and final phase, however, was a little bit more difficult than the rest of the phases, and that is because he will constantly be moving around, making it difficult to get any sort of damage. But on top of that, since I had to stand still to damage him, it also meant I was pretty much guaranteed to take damage back, as my only real opportunity to hit him was when he went in the air and summoned his meteors. So it was a bit of an endurance fight since I had to manage my health and healing, but eventually I was able to get the final blow on the boss. And just like that, the boss died. The sky base began to fall, so I landed on the king's crystal and caught the last princess. I rode the king's crystal all the way back to the castle and ended up where we started this run. All I had to do was kiss the final princess. You know, I'm starting to feel like this game's trying to tell me something. So I have over 300 hours into Castle Crashers, and I have done some pretty crazy challenges this past year. And with all these hours and challenges, I feel like I've gotten much better at the game. So I really wanted to put myself to the test and see if I could beat Castle Crashers without taking damage. I'm sure future me wouldn't regret this. So before we get into the run, let's go over the rules for this challenge. First and foremost, I cannot take any damage. That means no hits from enemies and no damage from the environment. And finally, glitches are allowed. But with the rules set, the Grey Knight falling down the stairs, we can get into this run. So I went for the Blue Knight since he can freeze enemies, something that is going to greatly help this run. So for the first part of the game, I don't really have to worry about anything since it's pretty easy to not take damage. And being the Giga Chad gamer that I am, I was able to defeat the War Machine and Barbarian boss without taking damage once. So I saved the Red Princess and I put all of my skill points into strength since I didn't really need to freeze enemies this early into the game. Moving into Forest Entrance and looking at this group of enemies, who do you think caused the most problems? Yeah, so Gator Boy here was pretty annoying, but we soon went past this and got into Thieves Forest. Now in Thieves Forest, you'll probably think I had a difficult time, since there are many thieves, a difficult boss fight, and of course, Seahorse. But on my first try, I was able to get to the Troll Mother without any issues. And for the Troll Mother, I actually beat her on my first attempt. I achieved this by simply ignoring her and focusing on her children. By keeping them in a constant juggle and moving left and right, the Troll Mother can't help but wander into damage. And since I've put everything into strength, each hit was doing a sizable chunk on her health bar, and pretty quickly she was defeated. But I did practice many hours of this for no stat insane. For the chase scene, I was able to get through the entire area without taking any damage, partly due to my 10 tips video, link in the description. We soon landed in the river, which was our first challenge, since there are many things that just want to damage you. And eventually we did get onto the catfish boss fight, and let's see how that went. Wow, that was okay. That was easy. I think Catfish has to be one of the easiest bosses in the game. So let's see how the bear boss fares. You'll have your reset cascade would be something. Wow, oh wow. Boss fight, by the way. For a challenge run, this has surprisingly gone smooth. In fact, I'm pretty confident that we're not going to struggle too much on this challenge run. But with the Catfish and bear boss defeated, let's see how PP Shadow fares. Yep, That's about the average PP Strello fight. Honestly, this point, it felt like we were just doing a regular playthrough, since it's pretty easy to not get hit. In fact, we got all the way to the Groom boss fight without taking any damage. Please Groom, please just hit me once. Next was the carriage chase scene, and if I showed you this image, who do you think damages me here? Myself, of course it's myself. But soon after defeating the giant troll, we run into a massive problem. The carriage goes into a cave and we get knocked off of it. The problem is, we cannot avoid this 1 damage. So to progress, we just had to take the 1 damage. So if you truly wanted to find out if you can beat Castle Crashers without taking damage, then the answer is no. But let's be real, most of you are here to see me suffer. So we continue with the run and move into the cave, which just so happens to have some of the most annoying enemies in the game. So in this cave, we had to deal with thieves that love to shoot their arrows. We had coneheads who love to throw their bombs, and just for good measure, let's throw some cave slimes in there too. This combination of enemies are a nightmare. With so many ranged attacks coming from pretty much anywhere, avoiding damage was very difficult. We did have to restart a few times, but eventually we were able to move on to the hardest level in the game, Cyclops Gate, where we had to avoid these extremely difficult spurts of lava. And on top of that, all the enemies in this area are completely invisible, meaning we can't see where the attacks are coming from. So after spending 3 hours on this one area alone, we were finally able to get past it and move on to Cyclops Fortress. For the first few waves of coneheads, I simply just heavy juggled them, since it's a pretty good way of doing damage without taking any yourself. And for the Fire Demon and Boss Conehead, I used my ice projectile to freeze them and keep them at a distance. This allowed me to do damage to both enemies without having to worry about them attacking me. Moving on to the Cyclops boss fight, there are 2 damage phases. You have his melee damage phase and his throwing knife phase. For the melee phase, he'll do 4 attacks with large damage windows in between. This is where we want to get our damage in. And for the throwing knife phase, we simply just had to hold our shield up. This fight overall is pretty easy to do without taking damage. In fact, you'd have to be throwing to take damage. Oh no, I just threw! But on the second attempt, we did it without any issue. Next is Lava World, and there are quite a few things here that want to damage us. Mainly, avoiding the lava and the fire demons were our #1 priority, and using medium juggle, the fire demons weren't an issue. The problem was when he arrived. So even before his boss fight, the necromancer is still causing problems, as when fighting the newly resurrected skeletons, I did get a bow to the face. But on my second attempt, I did bone the skeleton's back and made it all the way to the volcano. Now the volcano was surprisingly hard to defeat without taking damage. You of course have the fireballs you have to avoid, and there are also 2 fire demons that will never go away. You had to be beefy to damage the volcano, and when you are beefy, it is a lot harder to not take damage, since you have massively reduced movement speed. In an ideal situation, we want the fire demons to be on the other side of the volcano during our damage phase, but of course, they weren't going to do that forever. So the fight ended up being this awkward dance trying to avoid the fire demons whilst damaging the volcano. And of course, there was some wackiness too. But on our first attempt, we were able to defeat the volcano, meaning all we had to do was fight the dragons. Except, we didn't really have to fight the dragons. There's an extremely easy glitch which allowed you to avoid the dragon fight completely. And being a regular at Weenie Hut Jr., this is of course what I did. This is where I really want to know your guys' opinions. Do you think we should use glitches in these challenge runs? Do let me know in the comments below. But after another delicious meal at Weenie Hut Jr.'s, we were on to the industrial castle. Now for this area, the only real problem we had to worry about was the elevator, since there are a lot of enemies and not a lot of room. And on our first attempt, we did take damage and had to do it again. On the second attempt, we did take a sword blade to the face and had to try again for a 3rd time. We made it past the traps, made it up the elevator and all the way to the brute. Now since we were on the Blue Knight, we are able to just freeze enemies from a distance, and the brute is no exception. So we simply just sat back and froze the brute over and over. I'm sure the brute won't come back. And for the industrial machine, with some simple juggling and ice projectile, we were able to defeat it without any issues. Now in my last challenge run, the industrial prince was spared for the very first time ever. So maybe things were finally looking up for the prince. So anytime I do a challenge run, I do stream them. And sometimes these runs can take multiple days and streams. And in one stream, I ended it on the Industrial Castle, which is the one where the prince died. But for some reason, on my next stream, we redid the Industrial Castle again. And on this attempt, the prince lived. But yeah, I just thought I'd let you guys know. Back to the video. We crossed the ocean with no issue and made it into the desert. The desert. For this challenge run, the desert isn't bad. Going through it, we just had to be cautious of the scorpions, since they are unlimited and will always hit you if you get too close. And on our first attempt, we did get hit by a scarab whilst it was underground. On the second attempt, we got hit by a royal guard, and on the third, an antlion. But on our fourth attempt, we were able to defeat all the antlions, all the scarabs, and all the royal guards, meaning we'd finally beaten the desert. Oh, hold on, this is for me. Hello? Yeah, we beat the desert. What's that? There's more. Okay. So yeah, the desert isn't over, since we now have 2 boss fights. Luckily though, the aliens were one shot and the bosses themselves were pretty weak, meaning on our first attempt here, we did get onto the alien ship. On the alien ship, you'd think we'd struggle since it's a one-hit run, and there are many enemies. But since all of them were one shot, we were able to just juggle around the arena, avoiding being hit by the blasters. We moved on to Sandcastle, and for the beefies at the start, we simply used our ice projectile. But we couldn't always rely on this, since the game really wants me to fail. In fact, I really struggled on the upper Sandcastle, since at the time, I didn't know I could block the Saracens' tornadoes with my shield. If I had known that, I would have had a much easier time here. But after many resets, we did get onto the volleyball game, where I made sure I stood far behind the line, since the enemies can still hit you here. But after a comfortable 10-5 win, we could finally move on to the marsh. Now in the marsh, we get to see our good friend the Necromancer a second time, and not surprisingly at all, he makes our life hell, since he once again resurrects more skeletons, but make sure to add some beefies in there too. This was very difficult to do without taking any damage, and caused us to reset many times. Ultimately, I changed my pet to Rami, which would knock enemies over, reducing the chances of me being cornered, and this change made a massive difference, since we were able to combine my freezing with Rami's ramming, allowing us to defeat the enemies without taking any damage. I made sure to leave the area and then re-enter, so I didn't have to fight the enemies again. I embarrassed the Troll Mother for a second time and eventually moved on to the Corn Boss. Not only does the Corn Boss have one of the largest health bars out of any boss in the game, it also has very short damage windows and a move that can reflect your melee damage back, meaning melee was not a choice here. So I ultimately decided to go full magic as I grabbed the Unicorn Horn and the Beholder. This will give me the largest magical boost. Although the Blue Knight's magic is great at taking out beefies and normal enemies, it kind of sucks against large bosses. At max magic, the Blue Knight can only use their splash magic twice, and it does a pitiful amount of damage. This left us with only one viable damage source, projectile magic, and on my first attempt, I managed to get the Corn Boss down to less than half health, but I stupidly misclicked my button and took some damage. And on the second attempt, the exact same thing happened. On the third attempt, we got the Corn Boss to one shot, so surely we did it, right? Oh, so on the fourth attempt, we managed to get the Corn Boss down to one shot again. And do you remember when I said that it can reflect your damage back at you? A few more resets later, and we managed to get the Corn Boss to one shot again. Surely we had it this time. The problem was, when the Corn Boss has a small amount of health left, it will get enraged, meaning attacks get faster and the corn boss likes to go in and out the ground constantly, meaning we didn't have time to get our projectile magic off. But in the end, I remembered that Bipolar Bear exists. Now Polar Bear will instantly kill any enemies that are 8% or lower health, meaning we could skip the enraged mode entirely. So after picking up Polar Bear, we were able to do it without any real issue, but I'll never be able to regain my sanity. With the horn acquired, we could finally move on to Medusa. Like Cyclops, Medusa has some large predictable damage windows. By standing close to her, the only thing that could damage you is this one snake, and it can be blocked with your shield. So I simply attacked between blocking this snake and very quickly Medusa was defeated. Next was Full Moon, and this could definitely be an issue. Having to fight off beefies and avoid falling boulders definitely posed a challenge. We did have to reset a few times, but we were able to move further up Full Moon, where we could finally use Ladder Strat. Combining Ladder Strat with our Ice Elemental Infusion made it an extremely easy fight. In fact, we managed to defeat all these enemies on our first attempt. Moving into Snow World, and our biggest issue were the many snowballs. But what made this level manageable was the fact that the Eskimos are a light juggle, meaning they are relatively easy to take out. And for the Eskimos behind the ice barriers, we could actually select which ones we wanted to fight, meaning we could fight them one at a time. This made going through the stages a lot easier, and on our first try, we were able to make it all the way to the Frost King. Out of all the challenge runs I've done so far, Frost King has never been a notable boss, but for a no-hit run, Frost King is no joke. Let's start with a boss run. Every time we wanted to attempt the Frost King, we had to run past these falling icicles. Then we had to cross an ice bridge, which could either shoot arrows or ice. We had to defeat 3 Eskimos, and then finally we could have an attempt at the Frost King. And for the boss fight, what made this whole thing awful was the slippery floor. I cannot express how much I hate the slippery floor. For the Frost King's attacks, he only has 3 moves. The first one being this long summoning of ice, the second one being a fast ice attack, and the third one being icicles falling from the roof. A problem that I kept running into was not knowing what attack he was going to do, but often I would go straight in for the attack the second he teleported without realizing it was his fast ice attack. But what made this fight extremely difficult was the icicles. When you get the Frost King's health to about 60%, he will summon icicles from the roof, and these icicles persist even through his other attacks. This means you have to constantly be moving to avoid being hit. And to top it all off, the Frost King teleports more than an Enderman in water. It can't get worse. Can it? Oh yes it can, because when you get the Frost King to about 10% health, the icicles go into steroid mode. I spent hours on this boss, and on the attempts that I did it honestly seemed to just be good RNG. Since on one of the attacks, he didn't spawn any icicles, allowing me to get a large chunk of damage. And learning from my mistakes with the corn boss, I made sure to have Polar Bear to avoid the last phase annoyance, which meant I could finally move on to the last section of the game. The first boss is the Painter, and he isn't too bad. The Painter himself doesn't actually attack you, instead he summons paintings that will try and touch you. Coming into contact with a painting will cause him to explode and do a large amount of damage. So I simply spammed my melee for the Painter, and when it came to his paintings I used my magic. It wasn't ideal damage, but it was safe and easy, and before the Painter could even get to his final phase, he was defeated. Next was the Undead Cyclops, and this fight is even easier. Like the regular Cyclops fight, there are 2 phases, the melee phase and the fireball phase. But this time, however, there is an extra phase. The Cyclops will summon the Groom, and we cannot do any damage to neither boss. Normally, I would use PP Ground Strat to just wait this phase out, but that involves taking damage. So I simply just ran around the arena, avoiding contact with either boss. And after a few phases, Bipolar Bear decided he'd had enough and finished off the Cyclops. So out of the 4 final bosses, the first was easy and the second was even easier. Let's see how the third boss is. Oh dear. So next is the Necromancer, and so far in this run, he's caused us problems twice. And the third time is no different. The fight starts with a wave of enemies. This part is relatively easy. There's only one enemy that we really have to look out for, and that's the Conehead, since he's a heavy juggle and can't be juggled like the rest. The second phase is where the problem is. The Necromancer will summon even more enemies and 3 beefies. Normally, I use the fly strategy to stay in the air, avoiding any enemies, but the beefies are able to grab you no matter how high you are. So on top of this fight already being insanely difficult, there's a layer of RNG too. We died many times. And throughout my many hours attempting this challenge, I tried a few different strats. I tried flying close to the back of the wall so I could line up the enemies and use my magic to hopefully kill them. I tried killing the regular enemies before moving on to the beefies. I even found a strat that involved sitting in this corner and waiting for the beefies to come underneath me. I would then drop my bombs, hopefully killing them in that moment. But this was very inconsistent, sometimes working really well and sometimes not. Oh yeah, did I mention every time we died we had to rerun through 3 waves of cult minions? So it took a good few minutes just to get another attempt at the boss. But after so many hours, we finally defeated both waves of enemies without taking damage. So as the Necromancer fell into the fight, I jumped to melee'd him, catching him in a light juggle. I blissfully juggled the Necromancer around his own arena, and what felt like a lifetime, the Necromancer was finally defeated. And I can finally rest knowing that this run's over. Wait, that wasn't the final boss? So the final boss was the evil wizard, and he's kind of a joke. There are 6 different phases you have to fight. The first phase was extremely easy. By standing at the bottom of the screen, the crystals couldn't even damage me, meaning I could kill them in one phase. For the second phase, I simply just waited for the blue bubble, using my ice projectile to do damage. The third phase was, well, the third phase. For the fourth phase, you are able to actually get out of his range of damage, meaning I simply just had to fly next to him, allowing me to do damage, but be safe at the same time. The fifth phase is the fifth phase. And to give the wizard credit, the sixth phase wasn't that easy, since in the final phase, the wizard likes to move around a lot, making it quite hard to get consistent damage. Now I did reset a surprisingly amount of times on this boss fight, and definitely out of any challenge run I've done, this was the hardest evil wizard fight. Although I was rushing this fight as I really wanted to end the run, so I can't give him too much credit. So if I took my time, I probably could have done this in a lot less attempts. But I eventually got fed up and decided to just cheese the final phase. With some careful positioning, you could line up the evil wizard with this wall, and by dashing into the wall, you could instantly kill him. And with the evil wizard defeated, I landed on the crystal, caught the princess, and I could finally end this run. I do have more Castle Crashers runs planned, including a level 1 insane mode run, level 1 insane mode run, level 1 insane mode run, level 1 insane mode run. So we previously beat Castle Crashers without any stats on normal mode, and at the end of the video I said I would try to do it on insane mode. If you didn't know, insane mode increases most enemies' health and damage by 10. So if a boss has 1000 health, they now have 10,000 health. The rules for this run are simple. We have to be insane mode without spending any skill points. We can use pets, any weapon in the game, and also glitches. I need them. So before jumping in insane mode, I went and grabbed Snoot as he would give us a +4 to our strength. I also grabbed the Mind Catcher, which will give us a +5 to strength, +2 to defense, and a crit bonus. So like any Castle Crashers run, we begin in the barracks, enjoying ourselves until a Grey Knight gets knocked down the stairs. Heading outside, we can see the King's Crystal is being stolen by the evil wizard, so we are tasked with retrieving it, even though I am literally a peasant. Although the good thing is we are hitting for 18 damage right off the bat, so these barbarians should be defeated relatively quickly since we're doing a lot of damage. These are the starting enemies, right? Hold on. 500 health. That's more than the stove faces in normal mode. I then went and saved this shopkeeper from the barbarians, only for him to sell me a wooden sword. We soon came across our first boss, that being the war machine, and normally this boss is a breeze, but on insane it has 3500 health. So the war machine will have phases where it will shoot bombs but will stay relatively still. This is going to be our DPS phase. If you're damaging whilst in the air, the bombs will actually not be able to hit you. So by doing this, you can get a lot of DPS and be relatively safe. The war machine's other phase involves it driving around, knocking you over. The problem is that the war machine will summon barbarians, and as mentioned earlier, almost every enemy in the game has times 10 health and damage. This meant we could get melted pretty quickly. So after rerunning the entire area again, we did defeat the war machine on our second try. We moved up to the second boss of the run, that being the barbarian boss, and this is where it gets quite interesting. So on top of the times 10 rule for insane mode, some bosses will have some unique changes. So for this boss, after every attack he does, he will slightly increase in speed, meaning we have less time for damage and more attacks to avoid. And to add insult to injury, the barbarian boss does not drop any additional gold when compared to normal mode. But with the boss defeated, that's the first of 4 princesses saved. The other 3 are going to have a long time to wait. We soon encountered our next problem for the run, that being our first beefy enemy. Strangely enough, the beefy thief does not have an increase to their health from normal to insane, but they do have an increase to their damage. There is a strat to taking out beefies, which involves jumping and hitting them 4 times, which causes them to fall over. So with this beefy only having 200 HP, it wasn't too bad to take down. Next was the Thieves Forest, and we didn't really struggle. The forest is filled with thieves that shoot arrows, and they do a lot of damage. But as long as you can avoid these arrows, you can get through this area without much trouble. But what is trouble is one of the hardest bosses for insane mode. So the Troll Mother has 10,500 HP, although she does not attack you. The real issue is the trolls that she spawns. Each individual troll has 500 HP and hits for 80 damage. The problem is, with so many enemies, if you get caught in a crowd, well, you're pretty much dead. This means that you have to juggle doing damage to the Troll Mother and also killing the trolls. It gets worse as the Troll Mother will infinitely spawn trolls. So as you kill one, she will spawn another, and there can be a lot of them at once. This makes the Troll Mother one of the hardest bosses on insane mode. If you focus damage on the Troll Mother, the trolls will knock you down and kill you. If you kill the Troll Mother will spawn more. But wait, it gets even worse from here. When the Troll Mother reaches a quarter of her health left, she will move around when damaged. So anytime you hit her, she's going to run away. This makes it so difficult to get any consistent damage on her. So difficult, in fact, that it took us 33 attempts to beat, and every attempt we had to run through the entire Thieves Forest. I defeated the Troll Mother by focusing on her for her first 3 quarters of health, up until the point where she started running away when taking damage. I then put all of my attention on the trolls. I constantly kept them in a juggle, moving left to right, hoping that the Troll Mother would eventually get caught in 1 or 2 of my hits. Now don't get me wrong, this took an extremely long time to do, but after 6 hours and 33 attempts, I was ready to do whatever it took to defeat this boss. Oh god! After defeating one of the hardest bosses on insane mode, we luckily had multiple levels that were relatively easy. This led us on to our next boss of the run. So our next boss is the catfish, and very lucky for us, the catfish is easy. Almost every attack the catfish does can be blocked, meaning if we were patient and had our timing correct, we could essentially avoid all damage. On top of that, the catfish has damage phases which are 100% safe, meaning we could do damage without having to worry about dying. So the catfish was a battle of endurance, and honestly, after the Troll Mother, I was happy to have a break. Moving into tall grass fields, we come across our first small boss. These bosses are the same size as the player, meaning that you can juggle them. This of course makes the boss so much easier in these challenge runs. Being able to juggle enemies is one of the best ways to do damage as well as keep yourself safe. So out of all of the bosses so far, the bear boss was definitely the easiest as well as the fastest to defeat. Right after the bear boss, we get jumped by two beefy bears. This resulted in a death, meaning we had to go through tall grass fields and defeat the bear boss for a second time. But after them 33 troll mother fights, a second time isn't that bad. I also swapped out Snoot for Bipolar Bear, as Polar Bear will kill any enemies that have 8% or lower health. Considering some bosses can have upwards of 20,000 health in insane mode, then that means Bipolar Bear could insta-kill them when they've got 2,000 health. So after tall grass fields, we made it into PP Strello's cave and came across the second worst enemy in the game, the cave slime. Now these cute little guys don't seem that bad, and honestly at this point they're not. The problem is they have 750 HP, and every time you go to hit them they jump away, making it this extremely annoying cat and mouse chase that ends up taking a painfully long time. But after what felt like an eternity, we make it to the best boss in the game, PP Strello. Now remember earlier when I said some bosses have unique abilities in insane mode? Well, PP here is one of them. So good old PP will hit you for 999 damage. It doesn't matter what defense you have, you will always be one-shotted in insane mode. Although me and PP have a very special bond. So when I made a mistake and opened myself up for damage, PP decided not to kill me. And after that, the rest was history. PP was defeated and I will forever love him. So something new that's in insane mode are hidden checkpoints. So normally when you complete a level, you've completed it, you can move on. But in insane mode, there are hidden checkpoints that you need to get to in order to save your progress. And unfortunately, the next checkpoint from the flowery fields isn't until Cyclops Cave. That means in one run, we've got to beat Flowery Fields, the Groom boss fight, and the wedding carriage. And just for reference, it took me 2 hours and 15 minutes just to beat Flowery Fields and make it inside Wedding Crash. But going back to Flowery Fields, the bees and beekeepers were never an issue. The problem was the crazy amount of coneheads there were. Coneheads have a tendency to throw bombs, and oh boy, do they love their bombs. Just one of these bombs can do up to a third of my health. And to top it all off, there's a beefy conehead right at the very end that has 1900 HP. Yeah, I died to this guy too many times. But 2 hours later, we made it inside Wedding Crash and could finally move on to the next boss. So the Groom boss fight is a very difficult fight. He only has 4000 health, but has a massive damage resistance, meaning we only do half of our normal damage. He's very fast, has great knockback resistance, and does a lot of damage. Oh, and he loves to throw bombs. And every time I failed, I had to fight the 5 waves of coneheads before the boss itself. So after 1 hour of attempts, I ended it for the night and tried it another day. So the hidden checkpoints as mentioned earlier really were a pain. If I did not reach the checkpoint, I had to redo everything. So just a quick rundown, on the next time I attempted this run, it took me an hour to get to the Wedding Crash area and 2 hours of attempts on the Groom boss fight, but once again I couldn't do it and had to call it a day. On my third day of attempting the Groom boss fight, I actually beat the Flowery Field on my first attempt. Was this the run? Was this the day I was finally going to beat the Groom? No. Things were getting desperate. Was this really going to be the end of the run? Was the Groom going to be the boss that made me quit? Honestly, yeah, the Groom probably could have, but that's when all my prayers were answered. The GOAT himself, Flaming, came in and gave me one of the best tips to beating this. So we can actually use the boomerang to permanently stun lock the Groom. This means that he cannot move and not do any damage to us. He couldn't even play his organ. So after 10 hours, the Groom boss was finally defeated. So the next boss fight is the Giant Troll, and this boss fight was like a blessing. All we had to do was sit and spam the attack button. As long as we did damage to the boss, he couldn't damage us. So after watching his health bar slowly drain, I got knocked off of the carriage and went inside the cave. And finally, after 10 plus hours, we completed the Groom section. this cave section sucks. It has 3 of the most annoying enemies in all of the game. And do you remember the slimes earlier from PP Shadow's cave? Well, they're back, and now with 1250 health each. They also had a tendency to jump on my head, making my character unable to move. This left me open to attacks from the coneheads. And speaking of the coneheads, they threw bombs. It's all they do. So having to dodge the bombs and also deal with the slimes and their ridiculous health, it actually took us an hour and a half just to beat this small section. So we moved up into the Cyclops fortress, where we would eventually fight the Cyclops himself. But before that, we have to go through multiple waves of coneheads. And it took us 1 hour and 15 minutes just to get one run that got us all the way to the Cyclops. What made this area so difficult was the coneheads. There were multiple of them at once, meaning many bombs were being thrown, and if I got caught by a melee, then it did a lot of damage. On top of that, each individual conehead had 1700 health, and there were so many coneheads. So after an hour and 15 minutes of pure torture, I of course defeated the Cyclops, right? But don't worry, it only took another hour to get a second attempt. Please like and subscribe. But on our second attempt, I utilised a very funny glitch. By standing in the corner next to the lava pit, the Cyclops doesn't really know what to do and decides to just jump everywhere, making it a very easy boss fight. So after 1 week since being kidnapped, the second princess was finally saved. Next, we needed to retrieve the 2 relics in order to use the ship and cross the ocean. One can be found in Lava World and the other can be found in the Industrial Castle. Let's begin with Lava World. So despite fire demons having more health than coneheads, it was actually a lot easier than Cyclops Fortress. That is simply down to the fact that the fire demons can be somewhat juggled. If you didn't know, juggling is one of the most important mechanics in all of Castle Crashers, and even more so for this run. There are 3 types of juggles: light juggles, medium juggles, and heavy juggles. Light juggle is the bread and butter of Castle Crashers. Most enemies in the game have this kind of juggle, and it can be chained infinitely. Medium juggles are for enemies such as the fire demons. They're a bit more heavy than a light juggle, but can still be thrown in the air, but they cannot be juggled infinitely. Last is the heavy juggle, definitely the hardest to master. These are on enemies such as the coneheads. This is why Lava World ended up being so much easier than Cyclops Fortress. Being able to do constant damage whilst not taking any yourself makes all the difference in this run. So we were able to get all the way to the first boss without any real issues. And for the first boss of Lava World, you actually need to eat sandwiches in order to do damage. This is the first and only gimmick boss in all of the game. That means that it can only be damaged whilst being beefy. And something interesting about this boss is that it's the only boss in the game that is scaled via hits. So to defeat this boss, we only needed to hit it 70 times. And that was 1 boss down, 1 to go. Now the next boss is the dragon boss fight, but you are able to skip this boss entirely. By holding up my shield and shuffling left to right on the slope, I am able to enter no clip for my character. This temporarily allows you to walk out of bounds. Next I entered beefy mode, and just as it was about to run out, I went out of bounds, which allowed me to move up towards the golden wheel. You then need to hold up your shield in order to glitch back into bounds and pick up the golden wheel. But on my first attempt, I did actually fail this and was soft locked, meaning I had to quit out of the level and do it all over again. So after rerunning through all of Lava World, I gave it a second go, and this time I was able to do it. So the final relic we need is found in the Industrial Castle. Now the enemies in Industrial Castle do a lot of damage, to the point where they can almost one-shot me. But luckily, every enemy in Industrial Castle is a light juggle, making it extremely easy to do damage as well as avoid it. Well, almost every enemy. This Whopper has 2550 health. He's only one of the few beefies in the game that can't be juggled, meaning our damage options are very limited. But if I make a single mistake, he could very easily kill me. So on my second attempt, I tried some different strategies. The bow and arrow is really effective against beefies as it can do damage from a range and stun lock them. But our arrows did 1 damage. We could try throwing bombs, which actually did 62 damage per bomb plus fire damage. The issue is, we can only carry 9 bombs, and the brute has 20 2500 health, meaning we'd have to find something to make up for the rest of the damage. That's when I realised I could use the 2 fences that spawn alongside the brute. I actually found that you could get the fences to throw bombs quite often, and with some careful timing and positioning, I was actually able to get the enemy bombs to hit the brute, and each bomb did 350 damage, meaning it only took a few bombs to kill the brute, and once the brute was down, the final 2 fences were easy, so all I had to do was defeat the industrial machine. For this boss fight, there are 7 parts that you have to destroy. There are 4 pillars in the corners that spawn electricity balls, there's a pillar in the middle that will electrify the floor, a turret on the right that can swap between a flamethrower, acid thrower and ice thrower, and a big hand on the left. I first wanted to destroy the 5 pillars in the centre, as destroying them would give me more time to focus on the other 2 parts. So I cycled between each one as they popped up until eventually I destroyed all 5. For the turret, you could actually avoid all of the attacks by simply flying in the air and doing damage from there, meaning I could defeat the turret without having to take damage. So the final part was the hand. And this just so happens to be the most awkward and difficult part of the boss fight. So the hand attacks slightly above your head, meaning you can't really damage him while standing on the floor, and if you tried jumping in the air to do damage, you would get hit first. Normally, you would use magic to defeat this part of the boss, but we don't have that. And to make things worse, we had actually ran out of healing potions, meaning if we died here, we would have to do the industrial castle all over again. Luckily though, I found a method to do damage to the hand that was pretty consistent. By doing a light attack followed by a heavy attack, your character would do an uppercut. This allowed me to do damage in the air without having to jump. It only did 22 damage per hit, and to top it all off, I was one shot at this moment, making it an extremely intense fight. Oh, let's go. Let's go. Oh my god, dude, let's go. So on my first attempt of the industrial machine, I had beaten it. Normally I would allow my chat to decide the fate of the industrial prince, but I wasn't feeling it today. He fully deserved it. And after all that, we could finally retrieve the final relic. But the game had to remind me what was coming next. So with all the relics collected, we could finally cross the ocean and see what waited us on the other side.